Chapter 43 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. There was a great change in Agnes, and Madame de Brecy remarked it immediately. Hers was an earnest, though a cheerful spirit, and when she was thoughtful, those who knew her well might be sure she was debating something with herself, examining some course of action, trying some thought or feeling before the tribunal of her own heart. All that night, and all the following morning, she was very thoughtful. Her gaiety seemed gone, and though she could both listen and converse, yet at the least pause she fell back into reverie again. Jean Charost, too, was a good deal changed, at least toward Agnes, and the mother's eye marked it with very varied feelings. His manner was more tender, his language more glowing. There was a spirit in his words which had never been there before. He, too, was often very thoughtful, but Jean Charost had other motives for thought besides those connected with Agnes. Early on the morning of the day following the incidents lately detailed, he sent a man up to the watch-tower, with others, to keep his eye on the valley of the Cher, and Madame de Brecy remarked that the soldiers who had remained at St. Florent were no longer scattered about, either amusing themselves in the village or sporting in the courtyard, but were gathered together, all in busy occupation, some cleaning and rubbing down their horses, some polishing armor, or sharpening swords and lances, some skilfully making arrows or quarrels for their crossbow. She refrained from asking any questions till after the midday meal, but it was hardly over when the horn of the watcher upon the tower was winded loudly, and De Brecy, springing up from the table, ran up the stairs himself, as if on some notice of danger. There were several of the chief persons of his little band still around the board, but none of them moved or showed any sign of anxiety, and, in truth, they had been so long inured to hourly peril that danger had lost its excitement for them. The young lord was absent only a few minutes, but, on his return, he did not resume his seat, merely saying to the soldiers around, "To the saddle with all speed. Lead out all the horses. Some one bring me my armor. Do not look pale, my mother. I know not that there is any cause for alarm, but I heard yesterday that troops were tending towards Bourg in a somewhat menacing attitude, and I think it may be as well for us to leave St. Florent for a time, and return to De Brecy." "Are they English?" asked Madame de Brecy, evidently much frightened. "Not so," replied her son, "nor are they even the rebels on the English part. But I grieve to say these are royalists, perhaps more dangerous to the king's cause than even his open enemies. I will tell you the circumstances presently, for there may yet be some mistake. The spears we have seen are very distant, and few in number. Our good friend above was quite right to give the alarm, but neither he nor I could at all tell what troops they were, nor in what force. I will go back and see more in a moment. In the meantime, however, dear mother, it would be well to have all prepared for immediate departure. I cannot receive these gentlemen as friends in St. Florent, and they may be very apt to treat those who do not do so as enemies. Dear Agnes, get ready in haste. Tell Martin Grille to have my mother's litter ready. I will return directly." Thus saying, he again went up to the watch-tower, and remained gazing along the valley of the Cher for 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. There was much woodland in those days along that fair valley, and Jean Charost could not satisfy himself. Spearheads he certainly descried, but in the leafy covering of the scene they were lost almost as soon as perceived, and he could not tell their numbers. At length he turned to the warder, who stood silent, gazing out beside him, and pointed out one particular spot in the landscape. "You see that large tree," he said, "an evergreen oak it seems to be. The road divides there into two. One turns eastward to the right, the other comes towards the north. Watch those men well as they pass that spot. They must all show themselves there. If there be more than 50, and they come upon this road, blow your horn twice and come down. If they take the other road, remain quiet where you are till I come." The preparations of Madame de Brecy, under the effect of fear, had been very rapid, and she and Agnes were standing in the hall, ready for departure. A page was there also, resting on a bench half covered with armor, and as soon as his lord appeared, he sprang to arm him, asking, as Madame de Brecy had asked, Are they the English?" "No, boy, no," replied De Brecy; and then, turning to his mother, he said, "There is no need of great haste. We shall hear more presently. The fact is, the Count of Richmond," he continued, in a quiet, narrative tone, "has ridden the court somewhat too hard. He forced La Trimouille upon the king, as I told you the other night, and now he would rule La Trimouille, and through him his sovereign. He found himself mistaken, however, for Trimouille is a very different person to deal with from Giac or Beaulieu. Finding himself opposed, he determined to employ force, joining with himself the Counts of La Marche and Clermont, and advanced upon Châtellerault. When I left Poitiers, the king had chosen a decided part, and ordered the gates of Châtellerault to be closed against the counts. It was supposed, indeed, that the matter would be soon accommodated, for Richmond is needful to the king, and is himself but a mere cipher, except when serving his royal master. But since my arrival here, I have heard that, instead of submitting dutifully, he has levied larger forces, and is marching upon Bourges. If the troops I have seen be his, we shall soon hear more, and then, though doubtless there will be no great danger in staying, it may be better to retire before them. How do you go, dear Agnes, in the litter with my mother?" "Oh, no, I will ride," replied the beautiful girl. "I have become as good a cavalier as any man in your band." "Well, then, you shall be my second page," said Jean Charost, with a smile. "Come and buckle this strap on my shoulder. The boy can hardly reach it." Agnes sprang forward and buckled the strap, and Jean Charost gaily kissed her cheek, saying, "Thanks for the service, dear Agnes." His tone and manner were altogether so easy and unconcerned that even Madame De Brecy could hardly suppose that there was any cause for fear. But a moment after, the trumpet was heard to sound twice from the tower above, and then the step of the soldier descending the stairs heavily. "Now, dear mother," said Jean Charost, taking the old lady's hand, "you must let me lead you to your litter, for these friends of ours are coming this way. Run, boy, and tell Martin Grille and the rest to mount, and be gone on the road to De Brecy. Come, Agnes, come." All was soon in the court yard. It may seem an ungallant comparison, but all light things are more easily moved than weightier ones, and women, like dust, are soon disturbed by bustle. The very haste with which her son spoke destroyed all Madame De Brecy's confidence, agitated and alarmed her. Even Agnes felt a sort of thrill of apprehension come over her heart. But in those perilous times people were drilled into promptitude. Madame De Brecy and two of the maids were soon in the litter, and Agnes mounted on her horse by Jean Charost's side. She had seen him in times of suffering and of captivity. She had seen him go forth to battle and to danger. She had seen him in the chivalrous sports which in those times were practised in almost every castle in the land. But she had never ridden by his side in the hour of peril and command. On many a former occasion, deep interest, compassion, admiration perhaps, had been excited in her bosom, but now other sensations arose as she heard the clear, plain orders issue from his lips, and saw the promptness and submission with which all around obeyed. Surely woman was formed to yield, and, beyond all doubt, there is something very admirable to her eyes in the display of power. But she was to witness more before the day closed. As they issued forth upon the road down to the village of St. Florent, nothing was to be seen which could create the least alarm, and turning towards Solier, all seemed fair and open. But still Jean Charost was watchful and anxious, throwing out several men in front, and detaching others to the rear, while, as they approached the little valley which lies between the Cher and the Avon, and gives its name to the small hamlet of La Vallée, he sent one of the soldiers on whom he could trust to the top of the church tower, to reconnoitre the country around. The man came back at speed and rejoined the party ere they had proceeded far, bringing the intelligence that he had seen a considerable body of horse following slowly at about half a league's distance. "Then we have plenty of time," said Jean Charost, in an easy tone; but still he rather hurried the horses, and, mounting the hill, the towers of Bourges were soon in sight. At that time the road to Montluçon entered the road to Bourges much nearer to the city than it does at present, and it was along the former that the way of Jean Charost lay in going to De Brecy. if he wished to avoid passing through the city itself. But as he approached the point of separation, the sound of a trumpet on the right met his ear, and galloping up a little eminence, he saw a large body of crossbow men, with some 30 or 40 men at arms, coming up from the side of Luçon. They were near enough for the banners to be visible, and he needed nothing more to decide him. Wheeling his horse, he hurried down the hill again, and speaking to his lieutenant, said, "There are the men of La Marche in our way. There is nothing for it but to go through Bourg." "Here is Hubert, come back from the front, sir," replied the lieutenant at once, "to tell us that they have got a party on the bridge over the Avon. They shouted to him to keep back, so they will never let us pass into Bourg." "The best reason for going forward," answered Jean Charost in a gay tone. "We are nicely entangled, but we have made our way through against worse odds than this. How many are there, Hubert?" "Much about our own numbers, fair sir," replied the man. "The others are a great deal further off, but we are right between them." "Oh, Jean, will you be obliged to surrender?" asked Agnes with a pale face. "Surrender!" exclaimed Jean Charost, pointing to his pennon, which was carried by one of the men. "Shall De Brecy's pennon fall, my Agnes, before a handful of rebels, and you by my side? Give me my lance. Now, mark me, Dubois. The bridge is narrow. Not more than two can pass abreast. You lead the right file. Courbois, the left. Valentin, with the 8 last men, escort the litter and this lady. The object is to give them a free passage. We must beat the rebels back off the bridge, and then disperse them over the flat ground beyond. Go back to the side of the litter, my Agnes. 'Twere better you dismounted and joined my mother. Go back, dear girl. We must lose no time. Now, loyal gentlemen, use the spur. They have bid us back. I say, forward." Agnes was alarmed, but less for herself than for him, and notwithstanding the wish he had expressed, she kept her seat upon her horse's back, with her eyes straining upon the front, where she saw a plume of blue and white in De Brecy's crest dancing in the air, as his horse dashed on. On the little party went. Words were passed forward from front to rear. Quicker and quicker they moved forward, till a short turn of the road showed them the bridge over the Avon, partly occupied by a party of horse, several of whom, however, had dismounted, and seemed to be gazing nonchalantly up toward the walls of Bourg. Jean Charost gave them no time to question or prepare, for he knew right well who they were, and why they were there. Agnes saw him turn for an instant in the saddle, shout loudly a word which she did not clearly hear, and the next moment his horse dashed forward to the bridge at what seemed to her almost frantic speed. She saw him couch his lance and bend over his saddle-bow, but the next instant the greater part of his troop following hid him from her sight. There was a momentary check to their headlong speed upon the bridge, and she could clearly see some one fall over into the water. All the rest was wild confusion, a mass of struggling men and horses, rearing and plunging, and lances crossed, and waving swords and axes. Oh, how her young heart beat! But as she still gazed, not able to comprehend what she beheld, one of the soldiers suddenly took her horse by the rein, saying, "Come on, dear lady, come on. Our lord has cleared the way. The bridge will be free in another minute. 'Tis seldom De Brecy gives back before any odds." Agnes could have kissed him, but on they went, and she soon saw that he was right. Driven on to the open space beyond the bridge, the men of the Count La Marche still maintained the combat, but they were evidently worsted, for some were beaten back to the right, some to the left, and some got entangled in the marshy ground, and seemed scarcely able to extricate their horses. To Agnes's great joy, however, she saw the blue and white plume still waving on the right, and a clear space before them up to the walls of the city. Forward pressed the man who had hold of her rein. The litter came after it, as fast as the horses could bear it, followed by 3 or 4 servants in straggling disarray, but flanked on either side by several stout men-at-arms. This was not all, however, which Agnes saw when she looked back to assure herself of the safety of Madame de Brecy. On the other side of the bridge, and across the marsh which lies to the east, she beheld a large dark body of spears moving on rapidly, and at the same time, as they came closer to the walls of the town, cries and shouts were heard, apparently from within. "By the Lord, I believe they have won the city!" exclaimed the soldier who was guiding her. And almost at the same moment, a man from the battlement over the gate shouted something to the conductor, who replied, "The Seigneur de Brecy, just from Poitiers. Long live King Charles!" "Ride quick to the castle gate," cried the man from above. "The Count of Richmond is in the city. They are fighting in the streets, but we are not enough to hold the town. To the castle, to the castle!" And he himself ran along the battlements to the westward. Agnes's guide turned in the same direction, but was met by De Brecy coming at full speed, a little in advance of his men, who now, gathered all together again in good order, were approaching the gate which Agnes and her companion had just left. Jean Charost heard the tidings with evident pain and anxiety, but there was no time for deliberation, and with one cheering word to Agnes, he wheeled his horse and galloped on to another gate hard by, close to which rose up the large round tower and smaller square keep of the old citadel of Bourg. Strong works, according to the system of fortification of that day, connected the castle with the gate below, and the space between the wall and the marsh was very narrow, so that the place was considered almost impregnable on that side. A number of persons were seen upon the towers as Agnes rode on, and when she reached the castle drawbridge, she found De Brecy arguing with a little group of armed men upon the crenellated gallery of the gate tower, who seemed little disposed to give him admission. "Tell Monsieur de Royans," he exclaimed, "that it is his old friend De Brecy, and in heaven's name make haste. They are rallying in our rear, and the other squadrons coming on. You cannot suppose that I would attack and rout my old friends. You have yourselves seen us at blows on the meadow. Wheel the men round there, Dubois, behind the litter," he continued, shouting to his lieutenant. "Bring their spears down, and drive those fellows into the marsh if they come near enough." As he spoke, however, the chains of the drawbridge began to creak and groan, a large mass of woodwork slowly descended, and the portcullis was raised. "Forward, Agnes, forward!" cried De Brecy, riding toward the rear; and while he and a few of his followers kept the army in check, the rest of the party passed over the bridge, till they were all closely packed in the space between the portcullis and the gate. The latter was then opened, and riding on, Agnes found herself in a small open sort of court, surrounded by high walls between the inner and the outer gates. There were stone staircases leading up to the ramparts in different directions, and down one of these flights a gentleman in steel armor was coming slowly when the troop entered. "Where is De Brecy?" he exclaimed, looking down upon the group below. "I do not see him. Violet, you have not shut him out." "No, no, I am here," cried the voice of De Brecy, riding in from under the arch, while the portcullis clanged, and the drawbridge creaked behind him. "Pardi, De Brecy," cried the man from above, "you have brought us a heap of women. Men are what we want, for we have only provisions for a week, and we shall be closely pressed, I can tell you." "Here are 47 horses," replied De Brecy, "which will feed the whole castle for a month, in case of need. But there is no means of passing through the town?" "Impossible," cried the other. "They are just now fighting in the castle street, to bring in safely the grain out of the corn market." Agnes then, for the first time, became fully aware of her situation, and that she was destined to be for some time the tenant of a small citadel, closely besieged, and but very ill provided to resist. Chapter 44 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. The power of the mind to accommodate itself to all things is curiously displayed in the zest and carelessness with which soldiers, in the busy time of war, enjoy all short intervals of repose. The whole morning had been passed in skirmishing in the streets of Bourg, in strengthening every defense of the castle, and in collecting whatever provisions could be found in the neighboring houses, so long as the smallness of the force in the town permitted parties to issue forth from the citadel. But in the course of the day, the troops of the Count of La Marche and of the Count of Clermont entered Bourg, and joined the Count of Richmond. A strong party was posted across the river opposite to the gate of the castle, another occupied the bridge, and the blockade of the citadel was complete. Weary, however, with the long march and a morning's skirmishing, the troops of the revolted lords did not press the siege during the rest of the day. The defenders of the citadel, too, had but little opportunity of annoying the enemy or serving themselves; and from 3 o'clock till nightfall nothing occurred but an occasional shot of a cannon or a culverin, directed at any group of the enemy who might appear in the castle street, or at the parties on the opposite side of the river. True, the citadel was surrounded on every side by a strong force. True, the siege was likely to commence on the following day with vigor and determination; but still a sort of tacit truce was established for the time, and could any one have seen the little party of superior officers seated together in the castle of Bourges that night at supper, they would have seemed but a gay assembly of thoughtless men met together on some occasion of merrymaking. They laughed, they talked, and some of them drank deep, but none of them seemed to give one thought to their perilous situation, trusting confidently to the precautions they had taken for defense, and to the care and faith of those who had been left upon guard. Jean Charost, though perhaps the gravest of the party, seemed for the time as indifferent to the fate of the citadel as the rest, and seated next to Juvenel de Royans, conversed upon any subject on earth but the state of Bourges, dwelling upon former times and passed by occurrences, the days they had spent together in the household of the Duke of Orleans, after their meetings and the fatal events of Montereau. "What a strange thing life is, De Brecy," said his companion. "Here you and I meet, first as enemies, and are ready to cut each other's throats, then as young friends and brothers in arms, ready to sacrifice our lives for one another; and then here we are, beleaguered in this fusty old château of Bourges, with Richmond, who never spares an enemy, and La Marche, who seldom spares a friend, ready to dig us out of our hole, as they would a badger on the side of a hill. I forgot to mention our short meeting at Montereau, for, by my faith, I was too ill at that time even to do the honors of my quarters." "You seem wonderfully improved in health, De Royans," said Jean Charost. "You look younger by 4 or 5 years than you did then." "But a poor, battered old soldier, after all," replied De Royans, tossing up with his fingers one of the curls that hung at the back of his neck. "You see I am as gray as a wild goose. However, I am much better. A year's idleness on the banks of the Garonne, a little music, and a great deal of physic, cured my wounds, loosened my stiff joints, and enabled me to keep my horses back almost as well as ever. I have got on in the world, too, De Brecy, have made some very nice little captures, paid off many old debts, and got 2 companies of arquebusiers under my command instead of 1. I wish to heaven I had them all here. Had they been in the town, Richmond would never have got in by the northwest gate." "I marvel much that he did, I will confess," replied Jean Charost. "2 days ago I sent to Monsieur de Blondel there intimation that Bourges was in danger. I thought fit, indeed, to tell him the source from which I received the intelligence; but still it might have kept him on his guard." "Oh, I heard all about that," replied De Royans, laughing, "and we were all more or less in fault. When Blondel got your letter, he held it in his hand after reading it, and cried out in his jeering way, 'What's a hermit? And what does a hermit know of war?' Then said Gaucourt, 'As much as the pig does of the bagpipe, and why should he not?' And then they all laughed, and the matter passed by. But who is this hermit who has got such good intelligence? On my life, De Brecy, it would be well to have him in pay." "That you could hardly have," replied De Brecy. "He was once a famous soldier, my friend, and has met with many disasters in life. I went to see him upon other matters, but the intelligence he gave me, transmitted from mouth to mouth, I believe, all the way from Châtellerault to St. Florent, seemed so important that I left him without even touching upon my subject. He is looked upon as a saint by all the country round, and the peasantry tell him everything they hear." "But what, in fortune's name, took you to a saint?" asked Juvenel de Royans, laughing. "Was it to ask for absolution for wandering about the land with that lovely little creature you brought hither?" Jean Charost looked grave, but answered calmly, "That was no sin, I trust, De Royans, for I may call her my adopted daughter. She had indeed something to do with my going to see him, for he has great knowledge of her fate and history, and I wished to learn more than he has ever yet told me. It is time that she herself should know all. She will, it is true, have all I die possessed of, but still I could wish the mystery of her birth cleared up." "Why, surely this is not the infant you brought out of the wood near Beauté-sur-Marne, the child we had so many jests upon," exclaimed De Royans. "The very same," replied Jean Charost. "She has been a child to me ever since." "We thought she was your child then," replied De Royans. "Heaven help us! I have learned to think differently since of many things, and would gladly have wished you joy of your babe, if you had acknowledged her, right or wrong. But, as it was, we all vowed she was yours, and only called you the sanctified young sinner. 2 or 3 times I went down to good Dame Moulinet's to see if I could not get the truth out of her; but though she seemed to know much, she would say little." "Do you know if Dame Moulinet be still living, and where she is?" asked Jean Charost. "She was living a year ago, and not 10 miles from Bourges," replied De Royans, "in the village of Saulier, hard by the Cher. I had one of her sons in my troop. She and her husband are well to do now, for they have got her father's inheritance. They were tenants of that old Monsieur de Saulier, whose daughter our dear lord and master, the Duke of Orleans, carried off by force from her husband." Jean Charost started, and exclaimed, "Merciful heaven!" "Ay, it was bad enough," said De Royans. "Our noble lord had his little faults and his great ones, and some of them, I have a notion, embittered his last hours. This, above all others, I believe, affected him, for he had a terrible termination, as I dare say you remember." "No, no," answered Jean Charost. "I never heard of it before. How did it end?" "Why, the lady died," said De Royans gravely. "No one of the household very well knew how, unless it was Lomelini. Some say she was poisoned; some that she was stabbed in her sleep." "Not by the duke!" exclaimed Jean Charost, with a look of horror. "God forbid!" cried Juvenel de Royans eagerly. "He only loved her too well. No, there were strange tales going, but certain it is she died, and her death nearly deprived the duke of reason, they thought. Now I recollect, you first came about that very time. The lady had been ill some months, but, as there was the cry of a babe in the house, one might hear it from the garden, we thought that natural enough. Her death, however, surprised us all. Hypocritical Lomelini would have us believe that it was remorse that killed her. But there were a great many strange things that took place just then. One of the judges of the Châtelet was brought to the palace. There were secret investigations, and I know not what. You coming about that time made us think you had something to do with the affair. Some said you were her younger brother. But what makes you so sad, De Brecy?" "The subject is a sad one," answered Jean Charost, "and, moreover, new lights are breaking upon me, De Royans. Do you think, if Lomelini is still living, he could give me information upon those events?" "He could, if he would," answered his companion. "He is living, and as sleek as ever, and abbot of Briare. But I can tell you, I think, all that remains to be told. Poor old Monsieur de Saulier died of grief. I shall never forget his coming to the Palais d'Orleans to persuade the duke to give his daughter up, nor the despair of his countenance when the duke would not see him. The husband made away with himself, I believe, which was a pity, for they say this Count de St. Florent was as good a soldier as any of his day, and had fought in many a battle under Charles V. However, he never was heard of more, from the time the duke carried off his wife during his absence. That is all that is to tell. 1, 2, 3 died miserably for a prince's pleasures, and he himself had his heart wrung with remorse, which is better, perhaps, than could be said of most princes. It is a sad history, though a brief one." "And the child?" said De Brecy. Juvenel de Royans looked suddenly up with an inquiring glance. "I do not know," he said. "But do you think? Do you really believe?" "I know nothing," replied Jean Charost. "The duke told me nothing of all this. I had fancied he might have something of importance to communicate, and, indeed, something was said about giving me some papers. But he was murdered, and " "Did you never get the packet Lomelini had for you?" asked De Royans. Before Jean Charost could answer, a soldier came into the hall, saying, "Is there a Monsieur de Brecy here?" "Here he is, young man. What do you want?" asked De Brecy. "A letter addressed to you, sir," answered the soldier, advancing toward him. All eyes turned at once upon the bearer of the letter and him to whom it was addressed, and De Blondel, who was in command, exclaimed, "A letter, by the Lord! Unless we have taken to writing letters to one another, the gates of the old château must be more open than we thought." "I found it on an arrowhead, sir, just within the east barbican," replied the soldier. "Well, well, what contains it?" asked the other impatiently. "News or no news, good or bad, Seigneur de Brecy?" "News, and good news," replied Jean Charost, who had by this time received the letter and unfolded it. "Here's what he says," and he proceeded to read from the somewhat crooked and irregular lines before him the following words: "Faithful and true, this is to have you known that King Charles is already on the march for your deliverance. Hold out to the last, and 2 days will see the royal banner before Bourges. Let not your companions slight this notice as they slighted the last, for the shameful loss of Bourges can only be repaired by the brave defense of the castle." "He touched us there pretty sharply," said Blondel, "and, 'pon my life, what he says is true. So I, for one, swear by this flagon of wine, and if I don't keep my vow, may I never drink another, that I will bury myself under the ruins of the castle before I surrender it. What say you, gentlemen? Will you all touch the tankard and take the vow?" They all swore accordingly, for the chivalrous custom of making such rash vows had not departed, though Chandos, one of the most remarkable of vow makers, had laid his head in the grave nearly half a century before. It must be confessed, however, that Jean Charost took the oath unwillingly, for there were lives in that castle dearer to him than his own. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. This is not a book of battles and sieges, those fireworks of history which explode with a brief space of brilliant light, and leave nothing but dust, and tinder, and darkness. The man who gave an account of the 3 great battles of the world, and explained that he meant those which had permanently affected the destinies of the human race, probably named 3 too many. There is nothing so insignificant as a battle. The invention of the steam engine was worth 1,000 of the greatest victories that ever were achieved. This is no book of battles and sieges, and therefore I will pass over lightly the events of the 2 succeeding days. Suffice it, the Counts of Richmond, Clermont, and Marche pressed the castle of Bourges with all the means and appliances they could command. They attacked it from the countryside, they attacked it from the city, they assailed the gates and barriers, sword in hand, they endeavored to escalade the walls, but they were met at every point with stern and determined resistance, and though by no means well prepared for defense, the château held out. The besiegers lost many men, and gained nothing. In the midst of these scenes, Jean Charost was not inactive. Now on the walls, now at the barricades, and now quietly sitting in the high upper chamber of the Round Tower, with Agnes and his mother, and their maids plying the busy silk with trembling fingers. He tried to give encouragement to the soldiery, and to restore confidence and calmness to the women. There was something in his aspect, something in the perfect serenity of his look and manner, in the absence of every sign of agitation and anxiety on his face, which was not without its effect, and the news which he brought of the speedy coming of the King of France to the relief of his faithful vassals besieged in Bourges afforded bright hope and expectation. The services of himself and those whom he brought were great to the defenders of a citadel too large for the numbers it contained, and his quiet, unassuming bravery, his activity and ready presence of mind, won for him that respect which pretension, even well-founded, could not have gained. "I always knew he would make a good soldier," said Juvenel de Royans, somewhat proud of his friendship and their long companionship; and Blondel himself, one of the first knights of France, admitted that he had never seen a clearer head or stronger hand exercised in the hour of danger. At first sight it may seem strange to say that the news of the king's march, which brought hope and relief to the whole garrison, and, in one sense, to himself also, filled him, when considered in another point of view, with grief and alarm. But when Jean Charost considered what must necessarily be the consequence, at a moment when more than one half of France was in possession of a foreign invader, and the first vassal of the crown in arms against his sovereign, of an actual struggle between the monarch in person and three of those who had been his chief supporters, his heart sunk as he thought what might be the fate of France. During many a moment throughout the first and second day, when a pause took place in the attack, he meditated somewhat sadly of these things, but he was not a man only to meditate without action, and toward evening he took De Blondel aside to confer with him as to what was to be done. A few words presented the subject to the mind of the other in the same light in which it appeared to himself, and he then said, "I wish you very much to consider this, Monsieur de Blondel, as I think an opportunity is afforded you of rendering great service to France. Were I in your place, I would open negotiations at once with the constable, and represent to him the consequences that are likely to ensue. It would be no slight honor to you if you could induce him to cease the attack, and draw off his forces, even before the king appears, and little less if you could commence a negotiation which might be carried on after his majesty's arrival, and heal these unhappy dissensions." "By the Lord," cried Blondel, "if I were the king, I would have the head of every one of them, who by his insolent ambition and rebellious spirits gives strength to the arm of our foreign adversary, and takes away the strength of France. Nevertheless, I suppose he is obliged to temporize. But there are many difficulties in the way, my good friend. You are a negotiator, I am told, as well as a soldier. I know nothing of such things, and should only make a blunder. I should never know how to use the knowledge we possess of the king's coming without betraying the secret to the enemy." "Well, leave it to me," said De Brecy. "I will act in your name." De Blondel mused for a minute. "On the condition," he said at length, "that there is no talk of surrendering the castle, and also that you say nothing of the king's movements till he is actually in sight. But who will you get to go? On my life, the task is somewhat perilous, for Richmond is just the man either to hang any one who pretends to oppose his will, or drown him in a sack, as he did Giac." "I will go," replied De Brecy. "I have no fear. The constable is violent, haughty, domineering, but at heart he has a sincere love for France, a bitter hatred of the English, and devotion to the royal cause. Giac he scorned as well as hated, and besides, Giac stood in his way. Me he neither scorns nor hates, nor wishes to remove. By your leave, I will send out for a safe conduct by a flag of truce, and you will give me a general authority to treat, though, of course, not to conclude." De Blondel was easily led in such matters. A good soldier and a gallant man, he commanded skillfully and fought well; but his political views were not very far-sighted, and he was one of those persons who fancy they save themselves half the trouble of decision by looking only at one side of a question. The authority was given as amply as Jean Charost desired, and nearly in words of his own dictation. A flag of truce was sent out to demand a pass for the Seigneur de Brecy, in order to a conference with the Lord Constable, and the bearer speedily returned with the paper required, reporting that he had remarked much satisfaction among the rebel leaders at the message which he had carried them, in which they doubtless saw an indication of some intention to capitulate. A slight degree of agitation was apparent upon Blondel's face as Jean Charost, divested of his harness, and armed only with sword and dagger, prepared to set out upon his enterprise. "I do not half like to let you go, sir knight," he said. "This Richmond is a very furious fellow. There is no knowing what he may do." "I do not fear," repeated Jean Charost. "But, in case of any accident, De Blondel, I trust in your honor and your kindness to protect the ladies whom I leave here with you. They have some 30 or 40 men with them, who would each shed the last drop of his blood in their defense. But the honor of a knight, and that knight De Blondel, is a surer safeguard than 1,000 swords." The gates of the castle were soon passed, and the first barricade which the assailants had raised in the Rue du Château were reached without question. Some half-dozen men were lying on a pile of straw behind, lighted by a solitary lantern; but two of them started up immediately, and, though neither of them could read a word of the pass, they both seemed to have been previously informed of what they had to do, for they insisted upon bandaging De Brecy's eyes, and leading him on blindfold, as if conducting him through the works of a regular fortress. He submitted with a smile, for he knew every step of the city of Bourges from his childhood, and could almost tell every house that they passed as he was led along. The tread of the broad stone sill of the gateway, where they at length stopped, was quite familiar to him, and it was without surprise that, on the bandage being removed, he found himself in the courtyard of his old friend Jacques C[oe]ur. Conducted up a narrow staircase in one of the congregation of square towers, of which the building principally consisted, he was introduced into a small but very tall cabinet, lined with gilt leather hangings. In the midst stood a table, with three gentlemen surrounding it, and a lamp swinging overhead and showing a mass of papers on the board. The stern, square-cut head of the constable bent over them, the mild and rather feeble expression of Count La Marche, and the sharp, supercilious face of the Count of Clermont. "Here is Monsieur De Brecy, I presume," said the latter, addressing Richmond. The constable started up and held out his hand frankly, saying, "Welcome, welcome, De Brecy. Sit down. There's a stool. Well," he continued, as soon as the guard was gone and the door closed, "what cheer in the castle?" "Very good cheer, my lord," replied De Brecy. "We have not yet finished the pullets, and horseflesh is afar off." The Count La Marche laughed, but Richmond exclaimed, somewhat impatiently, "Come, let us to the point. You are frank and free usually, De Brecy. Say what terms of capitulation you demand, and you shall speedily have my answer." "You mistake my object altogether, my lord," replied De Brecy. "The castle is less likely to capitulate than when first you sat down before it. There are now men enough within to defend it for a month against 5 times your force, unless you shoot better than you have done these last 2 days; and we have provisions for some months, as well for our own mouths as for those of the culverins." "Then, in the devil's name, what did you come here for?" exclaimed Richmond angrily. "Upon business, my lord," replied De Brecy, "which I should wish to communicate to you alone." "No, no, no secrets from these gentlemen," said the constable; and then added, with a hard, dry laugh, "We are all chickens of one coop, and share the same grain and the same fate. Speak what you have to say before them." "Be it so, if you desire it, my lord," replied De Brecy. "I came to offer an humble remonstrance to you, sir, and to point out a few facts regarding your own situation." Richmond gave an impatient jerk in his chair, as if about to interrupt him; but De Brecy proceeded, "And that of the citadel, which I think have escaped your attention." "Ay, ay, speak of the citadel," answered Richmond. "That is what I should fain hear of." "I have told you, my lord," replied De Brecy, "that the citadel can and will hold out for more than a month, and nothing that you can do will take it. Long before that month is at an end, the king himself will be here to give it relief." "Well, let him come," exclaimed Richmond impatiently. "We may have the citadel before he arrives, for all you say." "I think not, sir," answered De Brecy; "and if you knew as much of the affair as I do, you would say so too. But let us suppose for a moment that the castle does hold out, and that the king arrives before you can take it." "Perhaps we can deal with both," cried Richmond. "And ruin France," answered De Brecy. "I will never believe that the Count of Richmond, the loyal, faithful Count of Richmond, that the Count of La Marche, allied to the royal race, or the Count of Clermont, well known for his attachment to the throne, would be seen fighting against their sovereign in the very moment when, surrounded by foreign enemies, he is making a last desperate struggle for the salvation of his country and your own." He turned slightly toward the Count La Marche as he spoke, and Richmond exclaimed in a furious tone, "Speak to me, sir. I am commander here. By the Lord, if you attempt to corrupt my allies, I will have your head off your shoulders." "You force me to speak in their presence, my lord," replied Jean Charost coolly, "and whatever I have to say must be said as boldly as if they were not here." "Nay, nay, let him speak, good cousin," said the Count La Marche. "It is but right we should hear what he has to say." My noble Lord Constable, said Clermont, cannot blame Monsieur de Brecy for acting on his own orders. We were his dear allies a moment ago, and partners to all his secrets. Why should we not hear the young gentleman's eloquence? Would I were eloquent, replied De Brecy. I would then show you, my lords, what a spectacle it would hold up to the world, to see one of the first officers of the crown of France at two of the first noblemen of the land, from some small personal disgusts at the king's prime minister, violating their allegiance, frustrating all their sovereign's efforts to save his country, plunging the state, already made a prey to enemies by military factions, into greater danger and confusion than ever, and destroying the last hope for safety in France. Richmond rolled his eyes from the speaker to the two counts, and from their faces to that of De Brecy again, while his fingers clasped ominously round the hilt of his dagger. "Let him do us justice," he cried. "Let him do us justice, and we will sheathe the sword." "Even if he have not done you justice," said De Brecy boldly, "is this a moment to unsheathe the sword against your lord, that sword which he himself put into your hands? Is this a time when every true son of France should sacrifice all personal considerations, and shed the last drop of his blood, were it necessary, for the deliverance of his country, to take advantage of the difficulties of his sovereign in order to wring concessions from him by force of arms? But has he not yet done you justice, my Lord Constable? Twice has his minister been sacrificed to your animosity. A third time you quarrel with the minister whom you yourself forced upon him, and plunge your unhappy country, already torn to pieces by strangers, into civil war, because the king will not, for the third time, submit to your will. Are his ministers but ninepins, to be set up and knocked down for your pleasure? Are they but tools, to be used as you would have them? And are you an officer of the king, or his ruler?" The constable started up, with his drawn dagger in his hand, and would probably have cast himself on De Brecy had not the Count La Marche interposed. "Hold, hold!" he cried, throwing himself in the way. "No violence, Richmond. On my life, he speaks well and truly. We are here for the public good." "At least we pretend so," said the Count of Clermont. "Really, my Lord Constable, you had better let Monsieur De Brecy go on, and speak quietly. We presume that he can say nothing that you would not wish us to hear, being chickens of the same coop, as you yourself have said, and the sharp arguments you seem about to use might convince him, but could not convince us." Richmond threw himself into his seat again, and thrust the dagger back into its sheath. "Let us consider calmly," said the Count La Marche, "what are to be the consequences if the king does come to the relief of this castle before we have taken it." "Simply that we shall be besieged in the good city of Bourges," said the Count of Clermont, "and pass 3 or 4 months very pleasantly, with such diet and exercise as a besieged city usually affords." "Merely to get rid of La Trimouille," said the Count La Marche. The door suddenly opened as he spoke, and a gentleman, armed all but the head, entered in haste. "I beg your pardon, my lords," he said, "but I have thought fit to bring you instant intelligence that trumpets have been heard in the direction of Pressavoix, and some of the peasantry report that the king is there with a large force." "So soon!" said Richmond. "Got between us and Paris," said the Count of Clermont. "The very movement is a reproach, my lords," replied De Brecy. "It shows that the king, unhappily, has been led to infer, from the surprise of Bourges, that 3 of the noblest men in France are in league with the common adversary. Oh, wipe away such a stain from your names, I beseech you. Send somebody to the king to make representations, if nothing more, and let not the Englishmen see true Frenchmen shedding each other's blood while they are riding triumphant over the land. My life for it, if you have any real grievance, they will be redressed when properly represented." "It is false!" cried Richmond vehemently, catching at some of De Brecy's words, and not heeding the rest. "We have no league with the enemy. We are faithful vassals of the crown of France, but we can be loyal to the king without being servile to his minister." "I doubt you not in the least, my lord," replied De Brecy. "Had I believed you disloyal, I never would have come hither. I have sought but to show you what language your actions speak, without ever questioning the truth and fidelity that is in your heart. All I beseech you now to do is to send someone at once to the king to negotiate terms of accommodation, and to show the loyalty you feel, before passion lead you into absolute treason." "I think the proposal is a very good one," said Count La Marche. "We can do no harm by negotiating." "At all events, it will put our adversaries in the wrong," said Clermont. "What say you, Richmond?" "Well, well," said the constable, "I say yea also, although I have known more great successes cut short, more mighty enterprises frustrated, more good hopes crushed by small negotiation than by battle or defeat. However, so be it. Let some one go, though, good faith. I know not who will be the man, being sure of one thing, that, were I Tremouille, and a sleek-faced negotiator were to come with pleasant words from Richmond, La Marche, or Clermont, I would write my answer on his forehead, and hang him on the first tree I found. When men have gone as far as we have, to my mind there is no going back. However, I yield to better judgment. Send some one if you can find him." Clermont and La Marche consulted together for a moment or two in a low tone, and, to say sooth, they seemed sorely puzzled; but at length La Marche looked up, saying, with some hesitation, "Perhaps Monsieur de Brecy would undertake the task." "Good Lord!" exclaimed the constable, slightly raising his hands and eyes. "I will go willingly," replied De Brecy; "but it can only be, my lords, to open the negotiation for you. Carry it on I cannot, as I am not of your faction. I shall require a letter under the hand of one or more of you, assuring his majesty of the loyalty of your intentions, and begging him to appoint persons to confer with yourselves or your deputies in regard to certain grievances of which you complain. In this I think I shall succeed; but I will bear you back his majesty's answer, and after that can take no further share in the affair." "What, then?" exclaimed the constable, in a tone of affected surprise. "You do not propose to rise upon our tombs to higher honor and preferment?" "Not in the least," replied De Brecy. "I am here, even at this present moment, merely as the envoy of Monsieur de Blondel, who sent me to you, as this authority will show." "Pooh, pooh!" said Richmond, in a contemptuous tone. "De Blondel has no wits either for the conception or the execution of such projects. But one thing I must exact, Monsieur de Brecy. If we send you to the king, you must hold no consultations in the castle before you go." De Brecy meditated for a moment, and then replied, "See Monsieur de Blondel I must, my lord, for I came from him to you, and must render him an account of what I have done. That account, however, may be very short. I can have him called to the barriers, and any one of you may hear what passes. I must, however, have horses and some of my train." "Be it so," said the constable. "I will go with you. You, Clermont, are a scribe, so write the letter to the king. It will be ready when we come back. Doubtless you will make it dutiful enough, and you need not say, unless you wish it, that Richmond is the only obstacle." With this sneer he rose, put his bonnet on his head, and accompanied De Brecy out of the room. As they went he said little, and at the barrier, both while Jean Charost waited for Blondel's coming and during their short conference, stood silent, with his arms crossed upon his breast. The governor of the castle, indeed, noticed the constable first, saying, "Give you good night, my lord." But Richmond only bent his head gravely in reply, and spoke but once during the whole interview, saying, when Jean Charost had given directions regarding his horses and men, "Send them down to Jacques Coeur's house, De Blondel, and that as quick as may be, for fear La Marche should have time to change his mind, and Clermont to fill his letter so full of tropes that no one can understand it." End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. The town and the castle were quiet. The hateful sound of the rattling cannon was heard no more. Perrier Vauglaire and Culverin was still, and the drum and the trumpet sounded not. When Agnes looked out of the high window of the great round tower, after a sleep which had remained unbroken by the clang of war longer than usual, she could almost have supposed that everything was peaceful around. The morning sun shone brightly, The morning air was sweet and fresh. Few soldiers appeared upon the walls of the castle. There was no strife scene going on in the streets, and it was only the sight of a barricade immediately below the town gate of the citadel, and a breastwork of earth some way further down, with half a dozen soldiers loitering about each, that kept up the memory of a struggle. Although she knew not the cause, Agnes was well pleased, for the very quiet stillness was a relief, restoring to the mind calmness and hope. But Agnes's hopes had now taken one particular direction, and her first thought was, as there is no active struggle going on, dear Jean will be with us soon this morning. But Jean Charost came not. An hour passed, an hour beyond the usual time of his coming, and both his mother and Agnes began to feel alarm. At length they sent down to inquire, but the answer brought up was, he had gone out on the preceding night, and had not yet returned. Had the wars and contentions which had raged through the rest of France prevailed in the neighborhood of Bourges, had Madame de Brecy and Agnes been accustomed to the scenes of strife and confusion which reigned in the rest of the country, had they been drilled, as it were, and disciplined to hourly uncertainty, they might have felt little or no alarm. But Berry had been nearly free from the evils that scourged the rest of France, and a wandering troop of royalist cavalry, or the sudden inroad of a small band of English or Burgundians, causing them to raise the drawbridge and drop the portcullis, was all they knew of the dangers of the times. Even during the short period they had spent in the citadel at Bourges, however, Jean Charost had always found means to spend a short part of each day with them, and although his not coming at the usual hour might not have caused much apprehension, the reply that he had gone forth from the castle and not returned agitated them both. The alarm of Agnes, however, was much more than that of Madame de Brecy. The aged feel this kind of apprehension from many causes much less than the young. Cares and griefs harden the spirit to endure. Each sorrow has its stiffening influence. Besides, as we approach the extreme term of life, we are led to value it less highly, to estimate it properly. When we contemplate it from the flowery beginning of our days, oh, what a rich treasury of golden hours it seems! And we think every one like us has the same dower. But as we look back at it when our portion is nearly spent, we see how little really serviceable to happiness it has procured, and we judge of others as ourselves. A friend dies, and though we may grieve, we think that we may soon meet again. A friend is in danger, and we feel the less alarm from a knowledge that in losing life he loses little, that a few years more or less are hardly dust in the balance, and that if he be taken away, it is but that he goes from an inn somewhat near us to his home further off. Agnes was very anxious. Hers was a quick imagination, active either in the service of joy or sorrow, and she fancied all that might have occurred, and much that was not likely. At one time she was inclined to believe that the commander of the castle was deceiving Madame de Brecy and herself, anxious to save them pain, that Jean Charost had been killed, and that de Blondel would not tell them. She little knew how lightly a hardened soldier could deal with such a matter. Then, reasoning against her fears, she thought that de Brecy must have gone forth upon a sally, and been made prisoner, and memory brought back all the sorrows that had followed Azincourt. But worst of all was the uncertainty, the toilsome laboring of thought after some definite conclusion, the ever-changing battle between hope and fear, in which fear was generally triumphant. She sat at the high window, gazing over the country round, and watching the different roads within sight. Now she saw a group coming along toward the gates, but after eager scanning, it proved nothing but some peasants bringing in provisions for the soldiery. Then an indistinct mass was seen at a distance, but long ere it reached Bourges, it turned away in a different direction. Each moment increased her anxiety and alarm. 1 hour, 2 went by. Again she saw some one coming, and again was disappointed. and the long-repressed tears rose in her eyes. The sobs with which she could struggle no longer burst from her lips. "Agnes, Agnes, my child, come hither," cried Madame de Brecy, and rising from her seat, Agnes cast herself upon her knees beside Jean Charost's mother, and hid her streaming eyes upon her lap. "What is it, my dear Agnes?" asked Madame de Brecy, much moved. "Tell me, my child, what agitates you thus? Tell me your feelings, all your feelings, my Agnes. Surely I have been to you ever as a mother. Conceal nothing from me." "Why does he not come?" asked Agnes, in a voice hardly audible. "Oh, dear mother, I fear he is ill. He is hurt. Perhaps he is—" "Nay, nay," replied Madame de Brecy. "You have no cause for such agitation, Agnes. A soldier can not command his own time, nor can he, amid many important tasks, always find the opportunity of letting those he loves best know his movements, even to relieve their anxiety. A soldier's wife, my child," she added, putting her arm gently round the kneeling girl, "must learn to bear such things with patience and hope, nay, more, must learn to conceal even the anxiety she must feel, in order to cast no damp upon her husband's spirits, to shackle none of his energies, and to add nothing to his sorrow of parting even with herself. Would you like to be a soldier's wife, my Agnes?" "I know not what I should like," answered Agnes, without raising her head; and then she added too quickly, as if her heart reproached her for some little insincerity, "Yes, yes, I should; but then I should like him to be a soldier no longer." A faint smile came upon Madame de Brecy's lip, and she was devising another question to bring forth some further confession, when through the open window came the sound of a trumpet, and Agnes, starting up, darted back to her place of watching. Oh, how eagerly she dashed away the tears that dimmed her eyes, and the next instant she exclaimed, with a radiant, rosy look of joy, which rendered all further confession needless, "It is he! It is he! There are a great number with him, some 20 or 30, but I can see him quite plainly. It is he!" Hardly 5 minutes elapsed, and Agnes had barely time to clear her face of the traces of emotion it displayed, when Jean Charost's step sounded on the stairs, and the next moment he was in the room. Very strange, Agnes did not fly to meet him. Agnes uttered no word of gratulation, but she stood and trembled, for there are sometimes things as full of awe discovered within the heart as any which can strike our outward senses, and a veil had been withdrawn which exposed to her sight things which, when first seen, were fearful as well as dazzling. "Joy, dear mother, joy, dear Agnes," said De Brecy, holding out a hand to each. "Your prison hours are over. A truce is proclaimed, negotiations for reconciliation going on, and you have nothing to do but mount and ride away with me. Quick, make your preparations, dearest mother. Quick, my sweet Agnes." "Do not hurry her, my son," said Madame de Brecy, kindly. "She has been very much terrified by your long absence, and has hardly yet recovered. She shall go in the litter with me, and I will tell Suzette to get all ready for her." "Terrified for me, dearest Agnes?" said Jean Charost, as his mother left the room, and he took her hand in his and gazed into her face. "Did they not give you the message I sent last night?" "No," answered Agnes in a low tone. "They only told us this morning, when we sent to inquire, that you had gone forth and had not returned. How could they be so cruel? One word from you would have saved us hours of pain." "You are trembling now," said Jean Charost, still holding her hand. "What would you do, dear Agnes, if you were a soldier's wife?" "Your mother asked me the same," answered Agnes with a faint smile, "and I told her I did not know. I can but make you the same answer, Jean. I suppose all a woman can do is to love and tremble." "And could you love a soldier?" asked De Brecy, in a very earnest tone. "Oh, that I could," murmured Agnes, trembling more than ever. Jean Charost led her toward a seat, and as she trembled still, and he feared she would fall, he put his arm around her waist, merely to support her. It had been there 1,000 times before in years long past, when she had stood by his side or sat upon his knee, but the touch was different now to both of them. It made his heart thrill and beat. It made hers nearly stop altogether. She was so pale he thought she would faint, and instinct prompted that the safest way was that of the proverb, to speak true words in jest. So, in a gay tone, he said, as he seated himself beside her, still holding his arm round her waist, "Well, I'll tell you, dearest Agnes, how it shall be. When you have refused some 6 other soldiers, you shall marry Jean Charost, and I will give you leave to love as much as you like, and to tremble as little as possible." Agnes suddenly raised her eyes to his face with a look of earnest inquiry, and then her cheek became covered with crimson, and she leaned her head upon his bosom. She said nothing, however, and he asked in a low and gentle tone, "Shall it be so, dearest Agnes?" "No," she answered, wiping away some tears. "I do not wish to refuse any one else." "Ah, then I must make haste," said Jean Charost, "for fear you should accept any one else. Will you be my wife, my own sweetest love?" Again she answered not, but her small soft fingers pressed gently on his hand. "Nay, but I must have a word," said Jean Charost, drawing her closer to him. "But one word, dear girl. That little hand cannot speak so clearly as those dear lips." "Oh, do not tease me," said Agnes, raising her head for a moment, and taking a glance at his face. "I hardly know whether you are bantering me or not." "Bantering you!" said Jean Charost, in a graver tone. "No, no, my love. I am not one to banter with your happiness or my own, and mine, at least, is staked upon this issue. For all that the world contains of joyful or of fortunate, I would not peril yours, Agnes. For this, when Monsieur de Brives sought your hand, I hid my love for you in my own heart, lest ancient regard and youthful fondness for an old dear friend should bias your judgment toward one unsuited to you. For this, I would fain have let you see a little more of life before I bound you by any tie to one much older than yourself. But I can refrain no longer, Agnes, and having spoken, I must know my fate. Will you be mine, sweet love?" "Yes, yes, yes," said Agnes, throwing her arm round his neck. "I am yours. I ever have been yours. I ever will be yours. You cannot make me otherwise, do as you will." "I will never try," replied Jean Charost, kissing her. "Dear mother," he continued, as Madame de Brecy re-entered the room, "here is now your daughter, indeed. I know you cannot love her more than you do, but you will love her now for my sake as well as her own." Madame de Brecy held wide her arms, and Agnes flew to her bosom. "My child, my dear child," said the old lady. "But calm yourself, Agnes. Here is Martin Grille, come to say the litter is ready. Let us go." "Ah, I thought how it would be," said Martin Grille to himself. "I never saw dear friendships between a man under 40 and a girl under 60 end otherwise. My lord, the litter is ready, and all the men at arms you named. The rest, however, seem somewhat surly at being left behind, for I think they have had enough of being besieged. I am sure I have. I shall not get that big gun out of my head for the next month." "Tell them there is a truce for 3 days," said Jean Charost, "and if, at the end of that time, war is not at an end, I will return and join them. We must not strip the castle of its defenders." In a few minutes Jean Charost and his little cavalcade were beyond the walls of Bourges, but Madame de Brecy remarked that they did not take the way toward their own well-loved home, but passing the river Langui, directed their course toward Pressavoix. "Where are you taking us, Jean?" she said to her son, who was riding beside the litter. "To the castle of Felard, my dear mother," replied Jean Charost. "I promised the queen that I would bring you and Agnes thither for a day. I am in great favor at court now," he added gayly, "for having had some share in bringing about this negotiation. The king, indeed, seems somewhat moody and irritable, but not with me, and he insists that I shall take part in the conferences to be held this night at Pressavoix. Nay, dearest mother, no objections on the score of dress and equipment, for let me tell you, the court is in travelling guise as well as we are, and you will find more soiled and dusty apparel than we bring into it." Madame de Brecy was in some trepidation, for it was long, long since she had moved in courts, and the retired and quiet life which she had passed for years unfitted her for such scenes. She made no opposition, however, and in somewhat less than half an hour the little cavalcade began to fall in with the outposts of the king's army. There was no difficulty in passing them, however, for, from the moment the truce was proclaimed, the soldiers on both posts concluded that some agreement would be arrived at between the different factions, and began to mingle together with as much gaiety and goodwill as if they had never drawn the sword against each other. Groups were seen galloping about the fields in different directions, standing and talking together upon the road, riding rapidly about to and fro between Pressavoix and Bourges, and the scene presented all the gaiety and brilliancy of war without any of its terrors. Shortly after passing the second line of posts upon the high road, Jean Charost led the way down a narrow lane, which seemed to plunge into a deep, heavy wood. All was now quiet and solitary, and nothing but the waving branches of great old trees was seen around for nearly half a mile. The undulations of the ground were so slight that no eminence gave a view over the prospect, and all that varied their course as they advanced was the strong contrasted lines of light and shade that crossed the road from time to time. At length, however, the lane turned sharply, an open space was presented to view, and the ancient château of Felard, which has long since given place to the present modern structure, rose upon the sight in the midst. It had towers and turrets, walls, ditch, and drawbridge, like most large country houses at that time, but it was by no means defensible against any regular force, and was only chosen for the residence of the court on account of the accommodation it afforded. Charles VII. Had not yet learned to dread the approach of his subjects to his person, to see poison in his food, and an enemy in every stranger, and the gates were wide open, without guards, and nothing but a few pages in attendance lingering about. Descending in the outer court, Jean Charost assisted his mother and Agnes to alight, and then led them to the principal entrance of the building, where they were shown into a vacant chamber to wait the pleasure of the queen. "Have the courtesy," said Jean Charost to the page, "to let Messire Jacques Coeur know that I am here, after you have informed the queen." And turning to his mother, whose face brightened at the name of her old friend, he added, "I only saw him for an instant last night, but his presence was most serviceable in obtaining for me speedy audience." At the end of about 5 minutes the door opened, and a lady entered alone, the richness of whose apparel, and perhaps still more, the brilliance of her beauty, made Madame de Brecy suppose that she beheld the queen. Jean Charost, however, addressed her as Mademoiselle de Saint Geran, and introduced his mother and Agnes to her, not altogether without some embarrassment in his manner. Agnes Sorel did not seem to remark it, however, spoke frankly and kindly to Madame de Brecy, and then, turning to Agnes, gazed upon her with a look of deep interest. "So this is your Agnes," she said, turning to Jean Charost. "Oh, de Brecy, do not bring her into courts. They are not places for such a flower as this. Is not that a hard speech, my dear young lady? Doubtless your young imagination has painted courts as very brilliant places, but I myself know, from sad experience, that they are fields where little grows but sorrows, disappointments, and regrets." "I have no inclination, indeed, madam, ever to mingle with them," replied Agnes. But Agnes Sorel was by this time in a deep fit of meditation, and seemed not to hear the fair girl's reply. After a minute's silence, however, she turned quickly to Jean Charost, and said, "Why did you name her Agnes?" "Youthful regard for yourself, I believe, was the chief motive," he answered frankly. "I had seen you, dear lady, in many a trying situation. You had generously, nobly befriended me, even at that time, and I wished this dear girl to be like you." Agnes shook her head slowly and sorrowfully, with an air which seemed to speak as plainly as words. "You wish so no longer." Suddenly, however, she roused herself, and said with a sweet smile, "I had almost forgotten my duty. Her Majesty has commanded me to bring you to her apartments. If you will follow me, Madame de Brecy, I will show you the way, and afterward will show you your lodging." End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 47. Just behind the old stone cross on the green of the little village of Saint-Privé, about half a mile south of Pressavoix, a large pavilion was erected, not far from the bank of the river. Between the two poles which supported it was spread a great table covered with writing materials, with 2 or 3 candlesticks placed in no very seemly order. 2 men, who appeared to be clerks, were seated at the table mending pens, and venting dry jokes at one another; and round about the pavilion, at the distance of about 50 yards on either side, patrolled a number of archers of the king's guard, to keep prying eyes and curious ears afar. For about a quarter of an hour the tent remained vacant of all but the clerks, but at the end of that time a group of several gentlemen entered it, and took their places on the northern side of the table, not sitting down, but standing together conversing earnestly, though in low tones. Shortly after, Jean Charost and Monsieur de Blondel appeared, and joining the others took part in their conversation. Then came Richmond, La Marche, and Clermont, with several other gentlemen of their faction, but these remained to the south of the table, although an occasional word or two passed between them and those on the other side. "Does his Majesty come in person?" said Richmond at length in his deep-toned voice. "On my life, I know not," replied Blondel; "but of course I should suppose not, my Lord Constable." "Then what do we wait for?" asked Richmond again. "Monsieur de la Trémouille is, I believe, commissioned by the king to treat," said Jean Charost. "At least, I heard so, my lord, while I was at the castle of Felard." "By the Lord, he must come soon, then," said Richmond, with a discontented air, "or no treating will there be at all; for I am not going to lackey a Trimouille, and wait upon his lordship's pleasure." A few minutes more passed in gloomy silence, and then the sound of horses coming fast was heard upon the road, through the canvas walls of the tent. The next instant La Trémouille himself, a tall, powerful, handsome man, entered the pavilion, leaning on the arm of Juvenel de Royans, his countryman and connection, and followed by Dunois and several others. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, for keeping you waiting," he said, with the blandest possible smile; "but I had to hear his Majesty's pleasure, in order that there might be no doubt or difficulty upon our part. Let us be seated and discuss this matter." Each one took his seat at the table without much order, the party of the king on one side, for kings were at heads of parties in those days, and the party of the 3 counts on the other. A pause ensued, which seemed to fret the spirit of Richmond, for at length he spoke, after giving a snort like a wild horse, exclaiming, "Some one speak, in heaven's name! What are we here for? Not to sit silent, I suppose. Speak, Trimouille." "Right willingly, my lord constable," replied Trimouille. "You are aware you are in arms against the king, your sovereign." "False to begin with," cried Richmond. "I am in arms against favorites and court flatterers; in arms to restore to the king the right use of his own authority, for the good of the nation and the safety of the land." "In arms against me, you would say," replied Trimouille, with a dark spot on his brow, which belied the smile upon his lips. "But let us hear what you complain of. I know of nothing done by me which can justify such acts as yours. However, if you have cause, state it before these gentlemen here present, who are commissioned by his Majesty, as well as myself, to inquire into this matter, and will report to him every word you say without gloss or comment, such as you accuse me of making. What are your griefs, my lords?" "Heavy enough," said Richmond sternly. "Your ingratitude, Trimouille, I could pass over, but—" "My ingratitude!" exclaimed the king's minister. "I know not that you have given me cause to be grateful or ungrateful." "Did I not place you where you are?" demanded Richmond. "Did I not remove better men than yourself to place you there? Did I not force Louvet from the council to make room for you, and punish the audacity of Beaulieu? And drown Giac, said the Count of Clermont, with a sarcastic smile, and all around the table laughed, except Trémouille himself, who had married the dangerous widow of the deceased nobleman. He waved his hand, however, saying, "This is all trifling. I hold the place I occupy by the king's favour and approval, and by the act of no other man. But you are in arms, you say, for the public service. What has been done to give you a colour for this pretence?" "I will tell you speedily," replied Richmond bitterly. "You have frustrated all my plans for the service of the state. During this last campaign in Brittany, you kept me idle before Pontorson, for want of men and money, or it would have fallen a week before it did. The same was the case before St. James, and now, for the last 4 months, not a livre have I been able to wring from your hands, either for my own pay or to keep my men on foot." "You will have been able to keep them on foot to war against your monarch," replied Trémouille bitterly; "but I will meet the charge with frankness and truth. I have not sent you money when you demanded it, for the same reason that I did not send any to my lord the Count of La Marche here, to whom I eagerly wished to send it, simply because I had it not to send." "A mere pretence!" exclaimed Richmond, striking the table with his fist and rising as he spoke. "We have found in the papers of Jacques Coeur, which we seized in Bourg, proof positive that a large sum was sent to Chinon at the very time you refused my demand." "Which was all forestalled before it came," said La Trémouille; but his voice was drowned by the angry tones of the constable, who exclaimed, "If we are again to be put off with such pitiful excuses as that, negotiations can produce no good," and he turned to leave the tent. The Counts of La Marche and Clermont rose also, but Jean Charost exclaimed, "Stay, I beseech you, my lords. Consider what you are doing, casting away the safety of France, giving her up a prey to the enemy, not only sacrificing your loyalty to your king, but your duty to your country. If there be one particle of patriotism, or of generosity, or of honour in you, stay and listen to what Monsieur La Trémouille has to propose." The word propose was happily chosen, holding out vague ideas of advantages to be obtained, which affected both Clermont and La Marche. "What shall we do, Richmond?" said the latter in a hesitating tone. "Stay, if you will," said the constable gruffly. "You can act for me if you choose to remain. I shall go, for I only lose my temper." Thus saying, he quitted the tent. La Marche and Clermont hesitated for a moment, and then returned to their seats, the latter observing with a quiet sneer that the constable lately gave them more fire than light. "Well, gentlemen," said Trémouille, in his most placable tones, "now this hot spirit is gone, we are likely, meseems, to come to some result. Pray let me hear your demands." The Count La Marche turned a somewhat puzzled look toward the Count of Clermont, and the latter laughed gaily. "Speak, I beseech you," said La Trémouille. "What are your demands?" "Why, the first of them we decided upon," replied the Count of Clermont, "was one so unpleasant to utter that it sticks in the throat of La Marche here, simply your removal from the council of the king, Monsieur La Trémouille." "I will not stand in the way," replied the minister, with the utmost frankness of manner. "No personal interest of mine shall prevent an accommodation; but on this point the king alone can, of course, decide. It shall be referred to him exactly as you state it. Let us pass on to other things. What more do you demand?" "Nay, we would rather hear what you have to propose," said the Count of Clermont, who began to doubt how the negotiations would turn. "I will willingly take the lead," said Trémouille, "for his majesty's intentions are kind and generous. First, however, it is necessary to state how matters stand, in order to show that it is by no compulsion the king acts, but merely from his gracious disposition. Here are 3 noblemen, 2 of them closely allied to the blood royal, take arms against their sovereign at a time when disunion is likely to be fatal to the state. The 2 I have mentioned, his majesty believes to have been misled by the 3rd, an imperious, violent man, overestimating both his services and his abilities." "Nay, nay," cried the Count La Marche. "Hear me out," said La Trémouille. "A man who pretends to dictate to the king who shall be his ministers, and publicly boasts of placing and displacing them at his pleasure. These 3 noblemen actually seize upon a royal city, and besiege the royal garrison in the citadel. The king, judging it necessary to check such proceedings at once, marches against them as rebels, and in great force. To speak plainly, my lords, you have 5,000 men in and about Bourg. He has 10,000 men between you and Paris, 5,000 more arrived an hour ago at La Vallée, and a large force under LiIII is marching up from Châteauroux." He paused, and the countenances of the constable's party fell immensely. However, the Count of Clermont replied, with his usual sarcastic smile, "A perilous situation as you represent it, my good lord. But methinks I have heard an old fable which shows that men and lions may paint pictures differently." "You will find my picture the true one, Clermont," said La Trémouille coolly. "I have taken care not to exaggerate it in the least, and both the generosity with which the king treats you, and the firmness with which his majesty will adhere to his determinations, will prove to you that he is convinced of these facts likewise. He is desirous, however, that Frenchmen should never be seen shedding Frenchmen's blood, and therefore he proposes, in mitigation of all griefs, real or supposed, and also as a mark of his love and a regard for his good cousin, the Count of La Marche, to bestow upon him the fief of Besançon. To you, Monsieur de Clermont, he offers to give the small town of Montbrison, or some other at your choice, of equal value. To the other noblemen and gentlemen I see around you, and whose names were furnished to me this morning, each a benefice, the list of which I have here, and all this upon the sole condition that they return to their loyalty, and serve the crown against the common enemy with zeal, fidelity, and obedience." "And the Count of Richmond?" said La Marche. "What for the constable?" asked the Count of Clermont. A heavy frown came upon La Trémouille's brow. He had remarked keenly the effect produced upon the constable's companions by the offers made, and saw that the faction was in reality broken up, and he replied in a slow, stern tone, "Permission for him to retire unmolested to Parthenay, and live in peace and privacy." A dead silence pervaded all the tent, which was first broken by Jean Charost, who saw both peril and injustice in the partiality just shown, and attributed it rightly to La Trémouille's personal enmity toward his former friend. "Nay, my good lord," he exclaimed, "surely his majesty will be moved to some less strict dealing with the lord constable." "What, you, sir?" cried La Trémouille, in a sharp and angry tone. "Yes, my good lord," replied De Brecy. "I had his majesty's own commands to be present here, and, as he said, to moderate between contending claims, and I shall feel it my duty to urge him strongly to reconsider the question in regard to the Count of Richmond, whom I do not mean to defend on the part he has taken with these two noble counts, but who has formerly served the crown well, and is only a sharer in the same faults as themselves." "You had better be silent, Monsieur de Brecy," said La Trémouille, with a lowering brow. "My lord, I was not sent here to be silent," said Sir Brecy, "and in speaking I only obey the king's commands." "Then go to the king and hear what he says now," said La Trémouille, putting on a more placable air. "I have seen him since yourself, and received his last directions. Go to him, I say. I am quite willing." De Brecy fell into the trap. "I will," he said, rising. "If you will proceed with all other points, I will be back before you can conclude." La Trémouille saw him depart with a smile, but no sooner heard his horse's feet than, sure of his advantage, he hurried on all the proceedings of the conference, threw in an inducement here, promised a greater advantage there, employed all the means he had kept in reserve of working on the selfishness of the constable's late confederates, and in less than 20 minutes had triumphed completely over faith and friendship and generosity to Richmond. He made the descent easy, however, by leaving all questions concerning the constable to be settled afterward, and succeeded in obtaining a written promise from La Marche and Clermont to return to their duty and submit to the king's will without any condition whatever in favor of Richmond. His leave-taking was hasty as soon as this was accomplished, and mounting his horse with all speed, he galloped back to Felard as fast as he could go. There, approaching the building by the back, he hurried up to the king's apartments, and inquired eagerly if Monsieur de Brecy had obtained admission. "No, my lord," replied the attendant. "His majesty was fatigued and lay down to rest for an hour. We therefore refused Monsieur de Brecy admission." You must not refuse me, said La Trémouille. The man hesitated, but the minister passed him boldly, and knocked at a door on the opposite side of the anteroom. A moment after he disappeared within, and then the murmur of conversation was heard, apparently eager but not loud. At the end of some 5 minutes, La Trémouille looked out, saying to the attendants, "If Monsieur de Brecy returns to seek an audience, tell him his majesty will see him at the general reception this evening, for which he is invited." And then, drawing back, he closed the door. Chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. Many are the perils of greatness, but among them all there are few more disastrous than that of being subject continually to influences the most corrupt, which poison the stream of human action almost at the fountainhead. False representations, sneers, innuendos, misstatements are ever fluttering about the heads of princes, guard themselves how they will against them. And I have seen the base, the treacherous, the coward, and the fool raised to office, honor, and emolument, the good, the wise, the just, and the true rejected, neglected, and despised by men not feeble-minded, not corrupt themselves, but strong in intellect, clear of sight, and with the highest and the noblest purposes. Princes and powerful men can but, as others do, judge and decide from what they see and hear, and the very atmosphere around them is misty with falsehood. Their very closet is an echo which repeats little else but lies. There was a great hall in the château of Felard, and in it, about 9 o'clock, were assembled many of the prime nobility of France. Gay habits were there, and handsome forms, and being so numerous, the party of course comprised some who were good and wise. It consisted principally of men, indeed, but there were ladies likewise present, the queen herself, Agnes Sorel, several high dames of Berry, and ladies attending upon the court. The young king, graceful and handsome, stood at the upper end of the hall by the side of his wife, and various guests from time to time advanced, spoke a few words to him, and passed on. All seemed gay and smiling. The news had spread around that the principal conditions of a treaty of accommodation with the late rebels had been signed, and joy and satisfaction at a result so greatly to be desired, yet which had been so little expected, spread a cheerfulness like sunshine over all. Little did he who had first suggested the steps which had led to such a conclusion, and had principally contributed to their adoption, dream at that moment of the evil that awaited himself. Jean Charost, after several persons of higher station than himself had passed the king's presence, advanced with a grave air from the end of the circle near which he stood. His countenance was calm and well assured, though thoughtful, and his eyes were raised direct to the monarch. He could see a dark cloud suddenly come upon Charles's face, and La Trémouille, who was at some little distance from the king, immediately drew nearer to him. The king bowed his head somewhat ungraciously in answer to the young nobleman's salutation, and then, seeing him pause without passing on, said harshly, "What is it, Monsieur de Brecy? Speak, if you have anything to say." De Brecy instantly divined that the king had been prepossessed, but that ancient spirit in him, which had led him, when a mere boy with the Duke of Orleans, to speak his mind plainly, had not been beaten out of him, even by all the hard blows of the world, and he replied, with one glance at his mother and Agnes, who stood at a little distance from the queen, but whom he could have well wished absent, "I have something to say, sire, which I would not venture to say at present, had you not yourself appointed me this as my hour of audience." The king slowly nodded his head, as if directing him to proceed, and Jean Charost continued, "To night, by your commands, I took part in a conference at Precevoix, and gladly found that your majesty was disposed to be most gracious to a number of your vassals and subjects who had ventured to take arms upon very shallow pretexts against your authority. Although no motive was necessary to explain your clemency, The motive which Monsieur La Trémouille did express was to reunite all Frenchmen in the service of the country. One solitary exception was made in this act of grace and goodness, and that exception was against a nobleman who, whatever may have been his faults lately, has, in times past, served the crown with zeal, skill, and courage. The frown was darkening more and more heavily on Charles's brow every moment, but he did not speak, and Jean Charost went on boldly. I have ventured to believe, sire, that you might be led to mitigate the severity of your just anger against the constable, and to consider former services as well as present faults, to remember how useful he has been, and may be still to France, and might be even induced to extend to him the same grace and favour which you hold out to his comrades in offence. Did you hear my will expressed by Monsieur La Trémouille? Demanded the king sternly and in a loud voice. I heard what he was pleased to say was your will, sire, replied De Brecy, but I presumed to differ with Monsieur La Trémouille, and to believe that by proper representations to your majesty, which I imagined had not been made, you might be brought to reconsider your decision, and be gracious in all as well as in part. And you expressed that difference at the council table? Said Charles. I did, sire, replied De Brecy, judging it necessary to the safety of France to do so. For which, sir, said the king aloud, and using the imperious plural representing the many powers united in a king, for which, sir, we banish you from our court and presence, and make you share the punishment of the fault you have defended. You did your best to frustrate our purposes entrusted to the execution of our minister. You nearly rendered abortive his efforts to bring about a pacification necessary to the welfare of the country, and it is probable that, had you remained on the spot, that pacification would not have been accomplished. We would have you know, and all know, that we will be obeyed. We have punished his rebellion in the Count of Richmond, more leniently, perhaps, than his offence required, taking into full consideration his former services, but weighing well the fact that he was the head and leader, the chief and instigator of the conspiracy, in which the rest were but his deluded followers. Unwarned by his example, you thought fit to oppose our will at our very council table, and we therefore inflict on you the same punishment as on him. The only grace we can grant you is to leave you the choice of your retreat, within 10 miles of which, wherever it may be, we require you to limit your movements. Say whither you will go. The first part of the king's speech had surprised and confounded De Brecy, but he gradually recovered himself as the monarch went on. He had long seen that Trémouille had sought to establish an almost despotic authority over the court of France, and he easily divined that Charles was not speaking his own sentiments, but those of his minister. This was some consolation, and he had completely recovered himself before the king ended. It was more by chance, however, than anything else that, thus suddenly called upon, he fixed on a place of retreat. By your majesty's permission, he replied, I will retire to Briare. I have, however, some weighty business to conclude, having been too much engaged in your majesty's service to visit De Brecy for several years. May I have permission to remain yet a few days in this part of the country? We give you 3 days, said the king, coldly inclining his head. I will need every exertion to accomplish what I have to do in the time, answered Jean Charost, and with much mortification in his tone. I will, therefore, beg leave to retire to De Brecy this very night. Come, my dear mother, come, Agnes, he continued, taking a step back. Hold, cried the king. Madame De Brecy, of course we do not oppose your departure with your son, but as for this young lady, we have had reason to believe very lately that the right of her guardianship exists in us rather than in Monsieur De Brecy. She must remain at our court and under the protection of the queen till such time, at least, as the matter is inquired into. A red, angry glow spread over De Brecy's face, and Agnes herself was starting forward, as if to cling to him in that moment of anguish and indignation. But Agnes Sorel laid her hand upon her arm and held her back, whispering eagerly, Do not oppose the king now. If you refrain, all might yet be well. Resist you cannot, and opposition will be destruction. He has brought her up from her infancy, my lord, the king, said Madame De Brecy in an imploring tone. I know of no one who could have so good a right to her guardianship as himself." "Dare he venture to say that he has any right to her guardianship at all?" asked the king. "That guardianship is his by blood, or that he has received it from one competent to give it?" "Perhaps not, sire," replied De Brecy boldly; "but I know of no one who has a better right than myself." His eyes were flashing, his face heated, his whole frame trembling with emotion, and, with his free and possibly rash habit of expressing his thoughts, it is impossible to tell what he might have said. But Dunois and Juvenel de Royans took him by the arms, and forcibly drew him away from the king's presence, toward a door at the end of the line of ladies and gentlemen, on the king's right hand. As this painful and exciting scene had proceeded, the open space before the monarch had been gradually crowded. The ring around had become narrower and narrower, and De Brecy was soon lost to the monarch's eyes in the number of persons about him. Dunois paused for a moment there, urging something to which Jean Charost gave no heed. But nearly at the same instant a small hand was laid upon his arm, and the voice of Agnes Sorel said in a low, earnest tone, "Leave her to me, De Brecy, leave her to me. I know all you fear, but by my Christian faith I will protect her and guard her from all evil. Here, give your mother your arm, and, for heaven's sake, for your own sake, for her sake, do not irritate the king." De Brecy heard no more, but, with the heaviest heart that had ever rested in his bosom, suffered Dunois to lead him from the hall. Juvenel de Royans followed, and when they reached the vestibule beyond, he wrung De Brecy's hand hard, saying, "This is my fault, all my foolish chattering; but, by the Lord, I will set it right before I have done, or I will cut my cousin Trimouille's heart out of his body." And with those words he turned sharply and re-entered the hall. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 49. For Jean Charost, a period of lethargy, I may almost call it, succeeded the scene last described. A dull, idle, heavy dream, a torpor of the spirit as well as of the body. It is not the man of many emotions who has the deepest. It is he who has the power, either from temperament or force of character, to resist them. His spirit has not been warmed by them, his heart has not been soiled by them, and when at length they seize upon him and conquer him, they have something to grasp. It was thus with him. In early life he had never known love. The circumstances in which he had been placed, the constant occupation, the frequent moving from place to place, and the absence of any of those little incidents which plant and nourish passion, had left his life without the record of anything more than a mere passing inclination. But when love seized upon him, it took possession of him entirely, filled him for a few days with hope and joy, and now plunged him into that spiritless lethargy. The events which were passing around him in France came upon him as a vision. Like the ancient prophet, he saw things in a trance, but having his eyes open, and they must be pictured to the reader in the same way that they appeared to him. A large, fine city on a beautiful river is besieged by a numerous army. Its fortifications are old and insufficient, the troops within it scanty, and preparations small. The cannon thunder upon it, mines explode beneath its walls, the enemy march to its assault, but they are driven back, and Orleans remains untaken. There is a bridge, the key, as it were, to the city. It is attacked, defended, attacked again. An old castle seems its only protection. The castle is attacked and taken by the enemy, and a man of magnificent presence, calm, and grave and gentle, mounts the highest tower therein, to direct his soldiery against the city. Suddenly the stone ball of a large cannon strikes the window at which he stands, and Salisbury is carried away, to die a few hours after of his wounds. The city still holds out. The attacks have diminished in fierceness, but round about the devoted place the English lines are drawn on every side, pressing it closer and closer, till famine begins to reign within the walls. There is a battle in the open fields, some miles from the besieged place. Waggons and tumbrils are in the midst, and gallant men, with the lily banner over them, fight bravely, but fight in vain. They fly, at length they fly. The bravest hearts in France turn from the fatal field, and all is rout, and slaughter, and defeat. Surely, surely Orleans must fall, and all the open country beyond the Loire submit to the invader. Let us turn away our eyes from this scene to another. The king's council has assembled at Chinon. The news of the defeat has reached them. Hope, courage, constancy are lost. They advised the monarch to abandon Orleans to its fate, to abandon Berry and Touraine, and make his last struggle in the mountains of Auvergne. The counsels of despair had been spoken, nor is it wonderful that a young man fond of pleasure, ruled by favorites, weary of strife, contention, and cabal, should listen to them with a longing for repose and tranquillity and enjoyment. Oh, how often is it, in this working day world of ours, that the most active, the most energetic, the most enduring thirsts, with a burning thirst such as the wanderer of the desert hardly knows, for the cool refreshment of a little peace. He stands in his own cabinet, not quite alone, for there is a beautiful figure kneeling at his feet. She raises her eyes to his face with looks of love and tenderness, yet full of energy and fire. Never, never, my Charles, she says, never, my king and master. Oh, never let it be said that France's king embraced the counsels of fear rather than of courage, fled without need, turned from his enemy before he was defeated. It is God's will that gives the victory, but it is for you to struggle for it. What if the courage of the people of Orleans faint? What if a battle is lost? What if the English pass the Loire? All this is true, or will be true within a month, my Agnes, replied the king, in a tone of deep despondency. I cannot prevent it. Suppose it happened, what can I do then? Mount your horse, set your lance in rest, give your standard to the wind, call France around you, march against the enemy, fight, fight, and, if need be, die. I will go with you, die with you, if it must be so. There is nothing for me but you and France on earth. God pardon us that it is so, but I have given, and you have taken from me, all else. Charles shook his head mournfully, and Agnes rose slowly from her knees and drew a step back. Then pardon me, my lord, she said, if I retire from your royal court to that of his highness the Duke of Bedford. It was predicted to me long ago by a learned astrologer that I should belong to the greatest prince of my time. I fondly fancied I had found him, but I must have been mistaken. And she retired still further, as if to quit the room. Stay, Agnes, stay, cried Charles. Stay, if you love me. Agnes sprang back again and cast her arms around his neck. Love you, she cried. God knows I love you but too well. And though our love has humbled, debased, and dishonored me, if it is to last, it must raise and elevate and animate you. For my sake, Charles, if not for your own, cast the base thoughts which others have suggested far away. Take the nobler part with which your heart would prompt. Dare all, encounter all, and save France, yourself, and Agnes. For be sure, I will never outlive the freedom of my country. There is many a noble heart yet beating in our France. There is many a strong arm yet ready to strike for her, and it needs but the appearance of the king in the field, and proofs of strong determination upon his part, to quell the factions which distract the land, and gather every noble spirit round his king. Whatever your love may have done to injure me, oh, let my love for you lead you to safety, honour, and renown. Well, be it so, cried Charles, infected by her enthusiasm. I swear by all I hold most sacred, I will not go back before the enemy. Let him cross the Loire. Let Orleans fall. Let every traitor leave me. Let every faint heart counsel flight. I will meet him in the field. Peril all on one last blow. Free France, or die. Let us back to the besieged city again. Gaunt famine is walking in the streets. Eager-faced men and hollow-eyed women are seen prowling about and vainly seeking food. Closer, closer draw the lines about the place. The bridge is broken down as a last resource, but the enemy's cannon thunders still, and the hands are feeble that point those upon the wall. Suddenly there is a cry that help is coming, that food is on the way, food and an army to force an entrance. There is a feeble flash of joy and hope, but it soon goes out. Men ask, who is it leads the host? Who brings the promised succor? A woman, a young girl of 17 years of age, some say a saint, and some a fool, and many weep with bitter disappointment. Nevertheless, on the day named, the ramparts are crowded, people go up to the towers and to the belfries. What do they see? A fleet of boats coming up the river, an army marching up the bank, lances and banners, pennons and bright arms are there enough. But still the hearts of the inhabitants, though beating with interest and expectation, hardly give place to hope. They have seen French armies as bright and gay fly before those hardy islanders who are now marching out of their lines to attack the escorting force. They have seen succor as near them, intercepted on the way. But right onward toward them moves the host of France, quicker, quicker, at the march, at the trot, at the gallop. Band mingles with band, spear crosses spear. The flag of France advances still. The boats sweep on and reach the city, and shouts of joy ring through the air, shouts, but not shouts so loud, nor warm, nor triumphant as those which greet that young girl as she rides through the streets of the city she has succored. But she was not content to succor, she came to deliver, and forth she goes again to plant her banner between the walls and the besieging lines, and there she sleeps, lulled by the roar of the artillery. Again the Maid of Arc is in the field. Again the standard of France is in her hand, and on she bears it from success to success. The enemy's forts are taken, the lines swept, the castle of the bridge recaptured, Orleans delivered, and her name united with it in everlasting memory. Joy, hope, confidence returned to France, and men's hearts were opened to each other, which had long been closed. Gergeau, Beaugency, and many another small town was taken, and across a country delivered from his enemies, the King of France marched on to take his crown at Rheims. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50. Flitting like shadows in a mist came many a great event in the history of France about that time, hardly known or appreciated by any except those who were the immediate actors in them. But amid them all, with a heavy heart and a dejected spirit, Jean Charost remained in exile at Briare. Why he had chosen that small town for the place of his retreat, he himself hardly knew. For although no human action is probably without its motive, some motives are so quick and lightning-like that all traces of them are instantly lost, even in the cloud from which they issue. It might be that he had been thinking deeply of the words of Juvenel de Royan, from the second night of the siege of Bourges till the moment when his sentence of banishment from the court was spoken, and that he had fully made up his mind to go thither sooner or later to converse with the abbot Lomelini. No other inducement, indeed, could be imagined, for Briare was then, as now, a very dull, small place, with its single street and hardly defensible walls, and nothing to recommend it but the smiling banks of the Loire, and the fine old abbey at the highest point of the whole town. Dull enough it was, in truth, to Jean Charost, without one object of interest, one source of occupation. Filial love, too, had deprived him of the consolation of his mother's company. The journey from De Brecy to Briare he thought was too long, the difficulties and dangers in the way too numerous for her to encounter them without risk to her health or to her life, and he had persuaded her to remain and keep the management of his estates in her own hands. Thus, with a few servants, he remained at the principal inn of the place, poorly lodged and poorly fed, but heeding little the convenience or inconvenience of the body, in the dull, heavy anguish of the heart. His spirit fretted sore within him, but yet he did not venture to resist the sentence of the king, unjust as it might be. It was a strange state that France was in at that period. Nobles would actually take arms against the royal authority at one moment, and submit to the most arbitrary decrees the next. And not only did De Brecy remain at Briare in obedience of the king's command, but Richmond, with all his impetuous spirit, lingered on at Parthenay for months. For some days after his arrival at the place of exile, occupied with other thoughts, Jean Charost forgot Lomelini entirely, and when he did remember him, and recalled the words which De Royans had spoken, he asked himself, "Why should I seek for information which may probably confirm the king's claim to the disposal of her I love?" Man's mind, however, abhors uncertainty. That thirst for knowledge which was kindled in paradise is upon us still. We would rather know evil than know not. On the fourth day, toward eventide, he set out and walked up to the abbey, and paused in the grey light, looking at the grey gates. One of the brethren, gazing forth, asked him if he would come in and see the church, and then De Brecy inquired for the abbot, and if he was still Brother Lomelini. The monk replied in the affirmative, but said the abbot seldom received any one after sunset, unless he came on business of importance, or was an old friend. "I am an old friend," replied Jean Charost. "Tell him Monsieur De Brecy is here. I will wait till you return." He was speedily admitted, and Lomelini seemed really glad to see him. He had become an old man, indeed, with hair as white as silver, had grown somewhat bowed and corpulent, and was slightly querulous withal. He complained of many things, of man's ingratitude, the dullness of the place of his abode, the forgetfulness of friends, the perils of the land, and all those things easily borne by the robust spirit of youth, which age magnifies into intolerable burdens. Still, he seemed gratified with Jean Charost's visit, and besought him to stay and take a homely supper with him. Poor monastic fare! But during the course of the evening and the meal with which it concluded, the young nobleman found that his old acquaintance had lost none of that quiet subtlety which had distinguished him in other days, and that his taste for good things was in no degree diminished. It had increased, indeed. Like an old dog, eating had become his only pleasure. He had become both a glutton and an epicure. Before he took his departure, the young nobleman asked openly and boldly for the papers which De Royans had mentioned. Lomelini looked surprised and bewildered, and assured him that Monsieur de Royans had made a mistake. "I recollect nothing about them whatever," he said, with an air of so much sincerity, that Jean Charost, though he had acquired a keener insight into character than in former times, did not even doubt him. He went back from time to time to see the old man, who always seemed glad of his society, and, indeed, Jean Charost could not doubt that company of any kind was a relief to one who was certainly not formed by nature to pass his days in a monastery. He remarked, however, that Lomelini from time to time would look at him from under his shaggy white eyebrows, with a look of cunning inquiry, as if he expected something, or sought to discover something. But the moment their eyes met, the abbot's were averted again, and he never uttered a word which could give any clue to what was passing in his mind at such moments. Thus had time passed away, not altogether without relief. A few hasty lines, sometimes from his mother, sometimes from Agnes Sorel, sometimes from his own Agnes, gave him information of the welfare of the latter, and cheered his spirits for a day. But often would the momentary sunshine be clouded by dark anxieties and fears. He had not heard anything for some weeks, and after a long ride through the neighboring country, he was about to retire to rest, when steps came rapidly through the long gallery of the inn, and stopped at his chamber door. It was a young monk come to tell him that the abbot, after supper, had been seized with sudden and perilous sickness, and earnestly desired to see him instantly. Jean Charost hurried up with the messenger to the abbey, and being brought into the old man's chamber, instantly perceived that the hand of death had touched him. The eyes spoke it, the temples spoke it, it was written in every line. Lomelini welcomed him faintly, and as Jean Charost bent kindly over him, he said, almost in a whisper, "Bid all the others leave the room. I have something to say to you." As soon as they were alone together, the old man said, "Put your hand beneath my pillow. You will find something there." Jean Charost obeyed, and drew forth a packet, yellow and soiled. His own name was written on it in a hand which he recognized at once. Something more, said Lomelini, and searching again, he found another packet, also addressed to himself, but the seals of this had been broken, though those on the other cover had been left undisturbed. Without ceremony, he unfolded the paper, and found within a case of sandalwood inlaid with gold, and bearing the letters M.S.F. twisted into a curious monograph. It opened with 2 small clasps, and within were 2 rows of large and brilliant diamonds. De Brecy's examination had been quick and eager, and while he made it, the dying man's eyes had been fixed upon his countenance. As he closed the case, Lomelini raised his voice, saying, "Listen, Seigneur de Brecy." Jean Charost put up the packets and sat down by the old man's side. He could not find it in his heart at that moment to speak harshly, although he now easily divined why the packets had been kept from him so long. "What is it, father?" he said, bending his head. "What? Not an angry word?" asked Lomelini. "Not one," replied Jean Charost. "I have too many sorrows of my own, father, to add to yours just now." "Well, then, I will tell you all," said Lomelini. "You think I kept these packets on account of the diamonds. That had something to do with it, but there was more. After you entered the Orleans palace, you were trusted more than me. I had been the keeper of all secrets. You became so. The duke's daughter was put under your charge, notwithstanding your youth, and I resolved you should never be able to prove her his daughter." "I knew not that she was so," replied Jean Charost. "The duke himself knew it not." "Nay, nay, do not lie," said Lomelini, somewhat bitterly. I watched you both well. I followed you to the convent of the Celestins, where the murderer had taken sanctuary, and I know the child was made over to you then, though you pretended to find it in the forest." "On my Christian faith and honor as a knight," replied De Brecy, "I heard nothing either of murderer or child at the convent of the Celestins. The dear babe was given to me in the forest by a tall, strange, wild-looking man, who seemed to me half crazed." "Saint Florent himself," murmured Lomelini. "I call heaven to witness," continued Jean Charost, "I never even suspected any connection between the duke and that child till long after. I am not sure of it even yet." "Be sure, then," said Lomelini, faintly. "The duke took her mother from that mother's husband, carried her off by force one night as she returned from a great fête, with those very diamonds on her neck." "By force!" murmured De Brecy, and then, from a feeling difficult to define, he added, "Thank God for that." "For what?" said Lomelini. "Doubtless she went willingly enough. Women will scream and declare they are made miserable for life, and all that. At all events, she stayed when she was there, and that was her daughter; for I knew the child again as soon as I saw it by the cottage, by a mark upon her temple, and the old father died of grief, and the mad husband stole in one night and stabbed his wife and carried away the child, and that is all." He seemed to ramble, and a slight convulsion passed over his face. "I know the whole," he added, "for I had a share in the whole," and a deep groan followed. "Let me call in a priest," said De Brecy. "You have need of the consolations of the church." "Ay, ay, call in a priest," answered Lomelini, partly raising himself on his arm. "I would not have my corpse kicked about the streets like the carcass of a dog. But do not suppose I believe in any priestly tales, young man. When life goes out, all is ended. I have enjoyed this life. I want no other. I expect no other. I fear no other. Surely there is no other. Well, call in a priest. Haste, or you will be too late. Is this faintness? Is this death?" Jean Charost sprang to the door, near which he found several of the monks. The penitentiary was called for in haste. But he was, as Lomelini had said, too late. They found the abbot passed away. The chin had dropped. The wide open eyes seemed to gaze at nothing, and yet to have nothing within them. Something had departed which man vainly tries to define by words, or to convey by figures. A spirit had gone to learn the emptiness of the dreams of earth. With a slow step and deep gloom upon his mind, Jean Charost turned back to his dwelling. As he went, his thoughts were much occupied with the dark, sad, material doctrines, philosophy I cannot call them, creed I cannot call them, which at that time were but too common among Italian ecclesiastics. When he was once more in his own chamber, however, he took forth the packets he had received from Lomellini, and opened the cover of the one which had the seals unbroken. It contained a letter from the Duke of Orleans, brief and sad, speaking of the child which De Brecy had adopted, of her mother, and of the jewels contained in the other packet. The duke acknowledged her as his child, saying, "I recognize her at once by the ring which you showed me, as the daughter of her whom I wronged and have lost. It was taken at the same time that my poor Marie's life was taken; for, as you doubtless know, she was murdered under my very roof. Yes, I say murdered. Had the dagger found my heart instead of hers, another word, perhaps, would have been better fitted; for mine was a wrong which merited death. I wronged her. I wronged the murderer." He then went on to urge Jean Charost to perform well the task which he had undertaken, and which he had certainly well performed without exhortation; and the duke ended by saying, "I have seen you so far tried, Monsieur de Brecy, that I can trust you entirely. I know that you will be faithful to the task, and as far as I have power to give authority over my child, I hereby give it to you." Those were joyful words to Jean Charost, and for a moment he gave way to wild and daring hopes. He thought he would claim that right, even against the king himself; but short consideration, and what he knew of the law of France, soon dimmed all expectation of success. The other papers which the packet contained were merely letters in a woman's hand, signed Marie de St. Florent; but they were pleasant to Jean Charost's eyes, for they showed how the unhappy girl had struggled against her evil fate. In more than one of them she besought the duke to let her go, to place her in a convent, where, unknown to all the world, she might pass the rest of her life in penitence and prayer. They spoke a spirit bowed down, but a heart uncorrupted. Several hours passed, not so much in the examination of these papers as in the indulgence of thoughts which they suggested, and it was midway between midnight and morning when Jean Charost at length lay down upon his bed. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 51. De Brecy woke with a start just in the grey of the dawn. His thoughts were confused. He had had troublous dreams. He had fancied himself in the midst of war and strife again, and the well-known sounds, "Alerte! Alerte! Aux armes! Aux armes!" seemed to ring in his ears. In an instant he had thrown on the furred gown which lay beside him, and had seized his sword; but the only sound he now heard was a sharp tap at the door, and a voice saying, "Monsieur de Brecy! Monsieur de Brecy! Pray let me in. I wish to speak to you in haste." Jean Charost opened the door, and, to his surprise, beheld the face of his good servant, Martin Grille, who had been especially left at the court with Agnes to attend upon and watch over her. A vague feeling of alarm instantly took possession of De Brecy's heart, and he exclaimed, ere the man could tell his errand, "How is your lady? Is she ill?" "No, sir, not ill," replied Martin Grille, "though ill at ease, I have a notion. But I have hastened here with such speed that I believe I have left my horse no lungs, nor myself either, any more than a cracked pair of bellows, to warn you, my lord, of a danger that menaces you. So I beseech you, before you hear it, to order all your people to get upon horseback, and make ready to set out yourself, for there is no great time to lose." "Nay, I must hear the danger first," replied Jean Charost. "What is the matter, my good friend?" "Well, tell the people to get ready at all events," said Martin, earnestly. "Then you can do as you like. Stories are sometimes long in telling, questions long in asking, and longer in being answered. It is always better, my lord, to be ready to act upon the news when it comes, than to have to wait to make ready after you have got it." There was some truth in what he said, and Jean Charost sent by him the orders he desired, nor was he long in giving them. "Now, tell me all while I am dressing," said his master, as soon as he had returned. "I know no cause for fearing anything, but it is an uncertain world, good Martin, and there are unseen dangers around our every step." "This one is plain enough," answered Martin Grille. "Notre Dame is not plainer. It is simply, sir, that the king has sent a certain sergeant of his, with a long troop of archers at his back, to arrest and bring you to his presence. He is now at Bourges, in the house of good Messire Jacques Coeur, which he fills tolerably well; and the distance not being very great from Bourges to Briare, you may expect our friend the sergeant every hour. It was late at night, however, when the order was given, and Master Sergeant vowed that he would have a nap first, king or no king. But vowing I would have no nap, I came away at once, and so you have 3 good hours, and perhaps a few minutes more." De Brecy mused, and then asked, "Do you know any motive for this order?" "None at all," replied Martin Grille, "nor can I even guess; but I'll tell you all that happened, as I have it from one who saw all. There is one Jeanne de Vendôme about the court. They call her also Marquise de Mortagne." "I have seen her," said Jean Charost. "What of her? Go on." "Why, she has a nephew, sir, one Peter of Vendôme," replied Martin Grille, "whom she is very fond of, but he is an enemy of yours." "I never even saw him," replied De Brecy. "Well, sir, the king's mind is poisoned against you," said Martin Grille. "That is clear enough, and I know not what else to attribute it to. But upon my word, you had better mount your horse and ride away. I can tell you the rest of the story as we go. I never was a very good horseman, and if the sergeant rides better than I, he may be here before we are in the saddle." "Well, be it so," said Jean Charost thoughtfully. "Gather all those things together, while I go and reckon with my host. I would rather not be taken a prisoner into Bourges, and I think I will prevent it." He spoke with a slight smile, and yet some bitterness of tone; but Martin Grille applied himself at once to pack up all that was in his master's room, and in about half an hour Jean Charost and his followers were in the saddle. "Were it not better to take the road to Bussiere, my lord?" said Martin Grille, who rode somewhat near his master's person. "It seems to me as if you were going toward Usain." "No, methinks we shall be safer on this side," said Jean Charost. "Now, as we ride along, let me hear all that has been passing at the court. Perhaps I may be able to pick out some cause for this sudden displeasure of the king." "Well, sir, I am sorry to be obliged to say what I must say," answered Martin Grille, "but the king has treated you very ill. This Peter of Vendôme, whom I was talking about, the devil plague him, is at the bottom of it all, though his aunt, who is a worse devil than himself, manages the matter for him. She has taken it into her head that she must ally herself to the royal family. Now it runs everywhere at the court that Mademoiselle Agnes is the daughter of the poor Duke of Orleans, who was killed near the Porte Barbette, that she was entrusted by him to your care, and that for ambition you want to marry her, and then tell all the world who she is." Jean Charost had been gazing at his face for the last moment or two in silence, but now he inclined his head slowly, saying, "Go on. I now see how it is." "Well, sir, about a month ago this Jeanne de Vendôme proposed to the king that her nephew should marry our young lady, and the king, it would seem, was willing enough. But a certain beautiful lady you know of opposed it, and, as she can do nearly what she likes, for some time the day went with her. Then Jeanne of Vendôme went and curried favor with Monsieur La Trimouille, who can do nearly what he likes on the other side, and then the day went against us for some time. The king was very violent, and swore that if he had any power or authority over Mademoiselle Agnes, she should marry Peter of Vendôme, though she told him all the while she would not, and begged him, humbly and devoutly, rather to let her go into a nunnery. Kings will have their way, however, sir, and things were looking very bad, when suddenly, 3 days ago, our young lady disappeared." "Where did she go to? Where is she?" asked Jean Charost sharply. That I cannot tell, sir, answered Martin Grille, but she is safe enough, I am sure, for when I told Mademoiselle de Saint Geran about it, she said, with one of her enchanting smiles, "Has she indeed, my good man?" Well, I dare say God will protect her. But the king did not take it so quietly. He was quite furious, and neither Peter of Vendôme nor his aunt would let his passion cool. Doubtless attributed it all to me, said Jean Charost, whose face had greatly lighted up within the last few minutes. But Martin Grille replied, to his surprise, "I do not think they did, sir. The painted old woman hinted, though she did not venture to say so, that the beautiful young lady you wot of had helped her namesake's escape, and the nephew said that if the king would but sign the papers, he would soon find the fugitive, for he had a shrewd notion of where she was." "He did not sign them!" exclaimed Jean Charost with a look of dread. "He had well nigh done it, my lord," replied Martin Grille. "Last night, when the king was sitting with the queen in the large black room on the second floor, which you remember well, very melancholy he was, for somewhat of a coolness had sprung up between him and her whom he loves best, and he cannot live without her. They brought him in the papers to sign, that is to say, Peter of Vendôme and his aunt, looking all radiant and triumphant. Some one watched them, however, for just at that minute in came the chancellor and 2 or 3 others, and among them one of the pages, with a paper in his hand addressed to the king. The king took it, and looked at the top, and then, handing it up to the chancellor, was about to sign what Peter of Vendôme demanded, and let him go. But Monsieur des Ursins, that is, the chancellor, cried, "Hold, your majesty, this is important, in good and proper form, and must have your royal attention." Then he read it out, but I cannot tell you all that it contained. However, it was a prohibition, in good set form, for any one to dispose of the hand, person, or property of our young lady, Mademoiselle Agnes, either in marriage, wardship, or otherwise, and setting forth that the writer was her true and duly constituted guardian, according to the laws of France. It was signed Saint Florent, and though the king was mighty angry, the chancellor persuaded him not to sign the papers till the right of the appellant, as he called it, was decided by some competent tribunal. "And how came you to know all this so accurately?" asked Jean Charost, after meditating for several minutes over what he had heard. "Part one way, part another, my noble lord," replied Martin Grille. "Principally, however, I learned the facts from a young cousin of mine, who is now chief violin player to the queen. When she found her husband so dull that night, she sent for Petit Jean to solace him, because she could not very well have sent for the person who would have solaced him best. He heard all, and marked all, and told me all, for you are a great favorite of his. However, I had something to do with it afterward myself, for the king, knowing that I was in the house, sent for me, and made me tell him whether, when you were last in Berry, you signed your name Saint Florent. I was frightened out of my wits, and I said I believed you did. The next minute the king said, looking sharply at the sergeant, who was standing near, 'Bring him at once from Briare. Lose no time.' Then he turned to me with a face quite savage, and said, 'You may go.' I thought he was going to add, 'to the devil,' but he did not, and I slunk out of the room. The sergeant went out at the same time, but he laughed and said, 'Sleep wasted no time,' and he was not going to set off for Briare at midnight, not he. So I did instead of him, for as I feared I had done some mischief, I thought I might as well do some good." Jean Charost smiled with a less embarrassed look than he had worn during the ride, but he made no reply, and during the next half hour he seemed to hear nothing that Martin Grille said, although it must not be affirmed that Martin Grille said nothing. It were hardly fair to look into his thoughts, to inquire whether the injustice he had met with, the wrong which was meditated against him, and the ingratitude for services performed and suffering endured in the royal cause, had shaken his love toward the king. Suffice it, they had not shaken his loyalty toward his country, and that although he might contemplate flying with his Agnes beyond the reach of an arm that oppressed him, he never dreamed of drawing his sword against his native land, or of doing aught to undermine the throne of a prince to whom he had sworn allegiance. At length, however, Martin Grille pulled him by the sleeve, saying, I cannot help thinking, my good lord, that you are taking a wrong course. You are going on right toward Bourges, and at any point on the road you may meet with the sergeant and his men. Indeed, I saw just now a party of horsemen on the hill there. They have come down into the valley, but that is the high road to Bourges they are upon." "My good friend, I am going to Bourges," replied Jean Charost; "but as I do not intend to go as a prisoner, if I can help it, we will turn aside a little here, and go round Les Barres, that hamlet you see there. We can then follow the by roads for 8 or 10 miles further, and cross the river at Cosne. I know the country well, for during the last 12 months I have had nothing to do but to think and to explore it." End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 52. It gives one a curious sensation to stand on the spot where great deeds have been enacted, to tread the halls where true tragedies have been performed, to fancy one sees the bloody stains upon the floor, to fill the air with the grim faces of the actors, to imagine oneself surrounded with the fierce passions of other days, like midnight ghosts emitted from the grave. I have stood in the small chamber where the most brutal murder that ever stained the name of a great nation was devised and ordered by the counsellors of John of Bedford. I have stood where an act of justice took the form of assassination against Henry of Guise. I have beheld the prison of the guilty and the unhappy Mary, and the lingering death chamber of the innocent and luckless Arabella Stuart. But although these sights were full of deep interest and even awe, the effect was not so strange as that produced by passing through ancient places of more domestic interest, where courts and kings, the brave, the fair, the good, the wise, or the opposite, had lived and loved, enjoyed and suffered, revelled and wept in times long, long gone by. Often when I have read some glowing description of masque or pageant, or scene of courtly splendour, and have visited the place where it occurred, I have asked myself with wonder, could it have been here, in this mean and poor-looking place? And have been led from an actual comparison of the scene with that described in the past, to conclude that in those earlier days men were satisfied with much less, and that the splendour of those times would be no splendour to ourselves. The great hall of Jacques Coeur, the wealthiest merchant in France, now holding high office at the court, and, in fact, the royal treasurer, a hall celebrated throughout all Berry, was indeed a large and well-shaped apartment, but still very simple in all its decorations. It was, perhaps, more than 40 feet in length, and 4 or 25 feet in width, was vaulted above with a semicircular arch, sealed with long planks, finely jointed together, of some dark unpolished wood. The same material lined the whole hall, but on the walls the wood was polished and panelled, and 4 pilasters, in the Italian fashion, ornamented each corner of the wall, and seemed, but only seemed, to support the roof. Many candles were required to give light to that large dark room, but it was very insufficiently illuminated. What little light there was fell principally upon the figure of the young king, as, seated at a small table in the midst, he leaned his head upon his hand in a somewhat melancholy attitude, and bent his eyes down toward the floor. "Will she come?" he said to himself. "Will she come? And if she will not, how must I act? This good merchant says she will, but I doubt it. I doubt it much. Hers is a determined spirit, and once she has chosen her part, she abides by it obstinately. Well, it is no use asking myself if she will come, or thinking what I must do if she refuse. Kings were made to command men, I suppose, and women to command them." And a faint smile came upon his lips at the conceit. While it still hung there, a door opened hard by, not the great door of the hall, but a smaller one on the right, and a sweet voice said, "Your Majesty sent for me?" "Agnes," said the king, rising and taking her hand, "Agnes, why have you left me so long?" "Because I have been ill and miserable," she answered, and the tears rose in her beautiful eyes. "And I have been ill and miserable too," said Charles, leading her to a seat close by his own. "Do you not know," he continued in an earnest and sad voice, "that from time to time a moody, evil spirit seems to take possession of me, making me sicken at all the toil and pomp of state, at all the splendour, and even all the gaiety of a court. His visits are becoming more frequent and more long. There is no one can drive him from me but you, Agnes." "Can I drive him from you always?" she asked. "Has he not resisted me lately, very lately, till I lost hope, lost courage, and was repelled to take counsel with my own heart, and listen to all its bitter self-reproach? Charles, Charles, oh my king and lord, there is nothing can console, nothing can comfort, under the weight of my own thoughts, but to believe and know that you are worthy of better love than mine, the love of your whole people. Take not that comfort from me. Let me believe that passion, nor moodiness, nor any evil spirit will lead you to do an act of injustice to any of your subjects." "Well, well," said Charles, kissing her hand, "it shall be as you will, my Agnes. You shall decide De Brecy's fate yourself. Of however rebellious a spirit he may be, however insolent his tone, I will forgive him for your sake. It shall be as you will." "Nay, not so," answered Agnes gently. "I ask you not to forgive insolence or rebellion. All I beseech you is, to inquire unprejudiced, and judge without favour. De Brecy is somewhat bold and free of speech. He always was so, even from his boyhood. But he is faithful and true in all things. I saw him peril his life rather than give up a letter to the Duke of Burgundy. I saw him submit to the torture rather than betray to the council the secrets of your uncle, the Duke of Orleans. It is his nature to speak fearlessly, but it is his nature to speak truly, and all I ask of you is to judge of him as he is, untinged by the yellow counsels of Trémouille, or the black falsehoods of that woman of Vendôme. I hear that some paper he has sent you has excited your anger, and that you have ordered his arrest. Before you judge, investigate, my dear lord. Remember that he has many enemies, that he has offended Trémouille, who never forgives, and that the love of my bright little namesake for him is an obstacle in the way of Jeanne of Vendôme, than whom a more poisonous viper does not crawl upon the earth." "I will investigate," answered Charles. "I will judge unprejudiced, and my better angel shall be by my side to see whether I keep my word with her." "Not alone, not alone," said Agnes, "or they will say, in their malice, that favour for me, not sense of justice, has swayed the king. Have your chancellor here. He is a noble man, and true of heart. Nay, let all who will be present to see you act, as I know you will act, justly and nobly, sternly if you will, for I would not have love pleading for love affect you in this manner. Oh, think only, my noble Charles, of how you may have been deceived against this young gentleman, how Trémouille's enmity may have read an evil gloss upon his actions, how Jeanne of Vendôme, with her false nephew, may have distorted the truth. Take the whole course of his life to witness in his favour, and then, if you assoil him of any fault, then Agnes, perhaps, may plead for favour to him." "She shall not plead in vain," said Charles, embracing her. "Some time to morrow, probably, the sergeant will be back, and I will hear and judge his cause at once, for we are lingering in Bourg too long. There is, moreover," he continued, holding her hand in his, and gazing into her eyes with a smile, "there is another cause for speedy decision. The king's authority, till this is all concluded, suffers some contempt. A daring act has been committed against our state and dignity, and hints have reached us that the traitor is above our power. 'Tis policy, in such a case, not to investigate too closely, but to remove all cause of contest as soon as possible." Agnes sank upon her knees, with a glowing cheek, and bent down her fair forehead on his hand, murmuring, "Forgive me, oh, forgive me!" Charles threw his arm round her fondly, saying, "Thank thee, my Agnes, thank thee for letting me have something to forgive." She was still at his feet when some one knocked at the door, and raising her gently, Charles said aloud, "Come in." "May it please your majesty," said a page, entering, "Monsieur de Brecy waits below to know your pleasure concerning him." A slight flush passed over the king's cheek. "This is quick indeed," said Charles. "Why does not the sergeant whom I sent present himself?" "There is no sergeant there, your majesty. Monsieur de Brecy, with a few attendants, came but a moment ago, and is in the vestibule below with Messire Jacques Coeur." "Let him wait," said Charles; "and in the mean time summon Monsieur des Ursins hither. Wait, I will give you a list of names." "Now, Agnes," continued the king, when he had dispatched the boy, "I will act as you would have me. We must have other ladies here. Go call some, love, some who will best support you." About an hour after, in that same hall, Charles was seated at the table in the midst, with his bonnet on his head and some papers before him. The queen was placed near, and some 15 or 16 ladies and gentlemen, members of the court, stood in a semicircle round. The door opened, and, ushered in by one of the attendants, Jean Charost, followed close by Jacques Coeur, advanced up the hall with a bold, free step. When within 2 paces of the table, he paused and bowed his head to the king, but without speaking. "Monsieur de Brecy," said Charles, "I sent one of the sergeants of our court to bring you hither." "So I have heard, sire," replied De Brecy; "but learning beforehand that your majesty required my presence, I set out at once to place myself at your disposal." "You have done well," said the king, "and we would fain believe that there is no contempt of our authority, nor disloyalty toward our person at the bottom of your heart." "I have proved my loyalty and my reverence, sire," replied De Brecy, "by shedding my blood for you in the field against your enemies, at all times and on all occasions, and by lingering in inactivity for long months at Briare in obedience to your commands." "Well," said the king, "it is well. But there be special circumstances when men's own interests or passions will lead them to forget the general line of duty, and cancel good services by great faults. Charges of this kind are made against you." "My lord, they are false," replied De Brecy, "and I will prove them so, either in your royal court by evidence good and true, or in the lists against my accuser, my body against his, and God to judge between us." He glanced, as he spoke, toward a slight young man standing beside La Trimouille, and the king, mistaking his look, replied with a light laugh, "Our ministers are not challenged to the field for their actions, Monsieur de Brecy. La Trimouille is a flight above you." "I thought not of Monsieur La Trimouille, sire," replied De Brecy. "I know not that I have offended him, and moreover, I hold him to be the best minister your majesty ever had, because the one who have made your authority the most respected. I spoke generally of any accuser." "Well, then," said the king, "in the first place, tell me, with that truth and freedom of speech for which you have a somewhat rough reputation, have you or have you not just cause to think that a young lady who has been brought up under your charge from infancy, and lately at our court, is the daughter of our late uncle, the Duke of Orleans?" "I have, sire," answered De Brecy. "Then how did you presume to claim the guardianship of her against our power?" said the king sternly. "As our first cousin, legitimate or illegitimate, she is our ward." "My answer is simple, sire," replied De Brecy. "I have never done what your majesty says, and if I had, when last I stood before you, I should have done it in ignorance; for it is but 3 days since I received from one Lomelini, abbot of Briare, then upon his deathbed, any certain information regarding her birth. These packets should have been delivered to me long before, but they were retained through malice. I now lay them before you, to judge of them as may seem meet." "Look at them, Des Ursins," said the king, and the chancellor took them up. "I can prove, my lord the king," said Juvenel de Royans, stepping forward, "that when last in Berry, Monsieur de Brecy was quite uncertain whose child the young lady was, for we had a long conversation on the subject when he gallantly threw himself into the citadel of this place to aid us in defending it for your majesty." "Silence, silence!" said the king, and taking up a paper, he held it out toward De Brecy, saying, "Did you sign that paper, sir?" "No, sire," replied De Brecy. "I never saw it before." "Then whose is it?" cried the king. "Mine," replied the voice of an old man, in somewhat antiquated garments, standing a step or two behind Agnes Sorel. "I signed that paper of right," and advancing with a feeble step, he placed himself opposite the king. "And who may you be, reverend sir?" demanded Charles, gazing at him with much surprise. "The man whose name is there written," replied the stranger. "William, Count of St. Florent, the only lawful guardian of the girl you wrangle for. You took my property and gave it to another. I heeded not, because I have no such needs now. But when you sought to take away the guardianship of this poor girl from him to whom I entrusted her, and to bestow her hand upon a knave, I came forward to declare and to maintain my rights. They have been dormant long, but they are not extinct. Each year I have seen her since she was an infant. Each year I have performed some act of lordship in the fief of St. Florent, and I claim my right in the king's court, my right to my estates, my right in my—" He paused for an instant, and seemed to hesitate, but then added quickly, and in a tremulous voice, "in my child." The king looked confounded, and turned toward the chancellor, who was at that moment speaking eagerly to Agnes Sorel, with the fell eyes of Jeanne of Vendôme fixed meaningly upon them both. "Monsieur des Ursins," said the king, "you hear what he says?" "I do, sire," answered the chancellor, coming forward. "You have made your appeal, sir," he continued, addressing the old man, "and perhaps, if you can prove your statements, his majesty may graciously admit your rights without the trouble of carrying your claim before the courts. You have to show, first, that you are really the Count of St. Florent; secondly, that the young lady in question is legally to be looked upon as the daughter of that nobleman. Her birth, at present, is not at all established. None of these letters but one prove anything, and that proves only a vague belief on the part of a prince long since dead." The old man drew himself sternly up to his full height, which was very great, and said, "You ask me for bitter proofs, chancellor. Methinks you might know me yourself, for I first gave you a sword." "I can be no witness in my own court," said the chancellor, "and the cause, if it be tried, must come before me." "Stand forward, then, Jacques C[oe]ur," cried the other. "Do you know your old friend?" "Right well," answered Jacques C[oe]ur, advancing from behind De Brecy. "This, please your majesty, is William, Count of St. Florent. I have seen him at intervals of not more than 2 or 3 years ever since he disappeared from the court and army of France, and have received for him, and paid to him, the very small sum he has drawn from the revenues of St. Florent. If my testimony is not enough, I can bring forward 20 persons to prove his identity." There was a dead silence for several moments, but then the chancellor said, addressing the king, "This may be, perhaps, admitted, sire. I have no doubt of the count's identity, but there is nothing to show any connection whatever between him and this young lady, whom the Duke of Orleans, in this letter, seems to have claimed as his daughter." At these words, a fierce, eager fire seemed lighted up in the old man's eyes, and taking a step forward, he exclaimed, "Ay, such claim as a robber has to the gold of him whom he has murdered." Then, suddenly stopping, he clasped his hands together, let his eyes fall thoughtfully, and murmured, "Forgive me, heaven." "Sire, I have forgot myself," he said in a milder tone. "My right to the child is easy to prove. I was her mother's husband. She was born in marriage. I myself gave her into the arms of this young man," and he laid his hand upon De Brecy's shoulder. "With him she has ever been till the time you took her from him. Let him speak for himself. Did he not receive her from me?" "Most assuredly I did," replied De Brecy, "and never even dreamed for a moment, at the time, that any one had a claim to her but yourself." "Nor have they," replied St. Florent sternly. "But it is strange, good sir," said Charles, "that you should trust your child to the guardianship of another, that other a mere youth, and, from what I have heard, well nigh a stranger to you." "There are wrongs, King of France, which will drive men mad," said St. Florent, fixing his eyes full upon the king's face. "Mine were such wrongs, and I was so driven mad. But yet in this act, which you call strange, I was more sane than in aught else. This young man's father I knew and loved, before he ruined himself for his king, and died for his country. Of the youth himself I had heard high and noble report from this good merchant here. I had seen him once, too, in the convent of the Celestins, and what I saw was good. I knew that I could trust her to none better, and I trusted her to him." "But can you prove that she is your wife's daughter?" asked La Trémouille, for these papers in the hands of the chancellor seem to show, and Monsieur de Brecy himself admits there is cause to believe, that she is the child of the late Duke of Orleans, and consequently the ward of the king." He spoke in a mild, sweet tone, but his words seemed almost to drive St. Florent to madness. His whole face worked, his eyes flashed, and the veins in his temples swelled. "Man, would you tear my heart out?" he exclaimed in a fearful tone. "Would you drag forth the dead from the grave to desecrate their memory?" And snatching up the other packet which De Brecy had laid upon the table, he tore off the cover, exclaiming, "Ha! These are trinkets! Poor, lost, unhappy girl!" And laying his finger upon the cover, he looked sternly at La Trémouille, saying, "Whose are these arms? Mine. Whose are these initials? Hers, Marie de St. Florent." As he spoke, he opened the case and gazed upon the diamonds. "Oh, Marie, Marie," he said, "when I clasped these around thy neck, little did I think but no more of that. My lord the king, what does your majesty say to my just claim? I gave my daughter's guardianship to this young man. I now give him her hand. I ratify your gift of the lands and lordships of St. Florent. What says your majesty?" "In sooth, I know not what to say or think," answered Charles. "I think I see my way, sire," said the chancellor, "although the case is somewhat complicated. If Monsieur de St. Florent can prove that this young lady is the daughter of his wife, he is undoubtedly, by the law of France, her lawful guardian, and all opposition to his claim grounded on other facts is vain. So much for that view of the case. But even supposing he cannot prove the fact, here is a letter from his highness the Duke of Orleans, whose handwriting I well know, which, though somewhat informal, contains matter which clearly conveys the whole of his authority over the young lady, if he had any, to Monsieur de Brecy. In either case, then, your majesty cannot err, nor violate any of your own edicts, or those of your predecessors, by restoring the guardianship to him from whom it has been taken under a misapprehension. Any other course, I think, would be dangerous, and form a very evil precedent." Trémouille bit his lip, and Jeanne de Vendôme slowly nodded her head with a bitter smile toward Agnes Sorel. "So be it, then," said the king, with a gracious look toward Jean Charost. "Take her back, De Brecy, if you can find her, which we doubt not; and if you bestow her hand on any one else but yourself, he shall have our favor for your sake. If you wed her yourself, we will dance at the wedding, seeing that you have submitted with patience and obedience to a sentence which we sternly pronounced and sternly executed against you, in order to teach all our court and subjects that not even those whom we most highly esteem, and who have served us best, will be permitted to oppose our expressed will, or show disobedience to our commands. Your sentence of exile from our court is recalled, and we shall expect, not only your attendance, but your service also, for, wedded or unwedded, we can spare no good sword from the cause of France." He spoke gaily and gracefully, and then looking round with a smile, he said, "Is there no wise and pitiful person who, in charity, can give us some information of where our fair fugitive is?" "In my castle of St. Florent," said the old count, who had now sunk down again into the appearance of age and decrepitude, "and there De Brecy will find her to morrow. Let him take her, and let him take her inheritance also, for I go back to my own living tomb, to work out the penance of deeds done in madness and despair." "Methinks, sire," said Jean Charost, who had marked some facts which created suspicion, "it were well that I should go to night. St. Florent is very insufficiently guarded, and these are strange times." "Nay, this is lover's haste," said Charles. "But, as you say, there may be danger of rash enterprises on the part of rivals, now that her abode is known. We will, therefore, to spare all scandal, entreat some fair lady to undertake the task of bringing her back to the court this very night, which is not yet far advanced. Who will undertake it? She shall have good escort, commanded by this gallant knight himself." "I am ready, sire," said Jeanne de Vendôme. "Then I beseech your majesty, let me go also," exclaimed Agnes Sorel eagerly. Charles looked from one to the other, and replied, somewhat jestingly, "Both go. A litter shall be prepared at once, and as moderator between you, ladies not always well agreeing when too closely confined, I will ask our good friend Messire Jacques Coeur to accompany you. Quick, ladies, prepare. De Brecy, see for your horses, and on your return you shall sup with us, and we will forget all but what is pleasant in the dream that is past. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Agnes Sorel by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 53. A little after 10 o'clock at night, a party of some 25 persons, escorting one of the large horse litters of the day, stopped in the courtyard of the old castle of St. Florent. One or two servants came forth to meet them, and instantly recognized De Brecy's right to admission. Lights were procured, and the young nobleman himself, handing Agnes Sorel from the litter, led her into the great hall, while Jacques Coeur followed with Jeanne de Vendôme. "My indignation at that woman's duplicity," whispered Agnes Sorel as they advanced, "has made me very thirsty. Let them bring me some water, my friend." Jean Charost gave the order she desired to the servant who went before them with the lights, and the whole party of four paused for an instant in the hall, Agnes Sorel bending her eyes upon the ground, as if lost in thought. Suddenly, however, she raised her head, saying, "Come, De Brecy, I will not keep you from your love. I will lead you to her. I know where she is to be found." "Ha!" said Jeanne de Vendôme with a very marked emphasis, as Jean Charost and his fair companion left the room. "Will you not go with them, madam?" asked Jacques Coeur, who had no great love for the lady left behind. "I think not," replied Jeanne de Vendôme in a quiet, easy tone. "Lovers' meetings should have as few witnesses as possible." And she and Jacques Coeur remained in the hall, the good merchant going to the window and gazing out upon the night. A minute or two after, the servant returned with a flagon of water from the castle well, and a silver drinking cup. These he set upon the table, and retired. Jeanne de Vendôme gazed at them for a moment, and then said aloud, "I am thirsty too." Quietly approaching the table, she placed herself in such a position as to stand between the flagon and Jacques Coeur, poured herself out some water, drank, set down the cup again, and after remaining a short time in that position, turned to the window, and took her place beside the merchant. In the meantime, Jean Charost, with a light in his hand, accompanied Agnes Sorel up the stairs, and through a long passage at the top. "You seem to know the castle even better than I do," he said, as she guided him on. "I have been this road in secret once before," she answered gaily. "Mine is a happier errand now, De Brecy, but we must thread out the labyrinth. I have hid your little gem where best it might lie concealed." A few moments more, however, brought them to a door which Agnes Sorel opened, and there, with an elderly waiting maid of Madame De Brecy's, stood his own Agnes, gazing with anxious terror toward the door. She was somewhat pale, somewhat thinner than she had been, and the noise of horses' feet in the court below had made her heart beat fearfully. The moment she saw De Brecy, however, she sprang forward and cast herself into his arms. He pressed her closely to his heart, but all he could say was, "My Agnes, my own Agnes, all is well, and you are mine." Agnes Sorel put a fair hand upon the arm of each. "May you love ever as you love now," she said, "and may God bless you in your love. Oh, De Brecy, just a year ago you gave me the most painful moment I have ever felt. When I told you I would guard and protect her, there came such a look, oh, such a look in your face, a look of doubt and fear, more reproachful, more monitory, more condemnatory than anything but my own heart has ever spoken. I give her back to you now, pure and bright, and true as you left her with me, with the bloom and brightness of her mind as fresh and unsoiled as ever. Love her, and be beloved, and may God bless you ever." De Brecy took her hand and kissed it. "For how much I have to thank you," he answered, "for all, for everything; for I am certain that but for your influence this happy meeting would have never been." "It might not," answered Agnes, with a cheek glowing with many emotions. "But I call heaven to witness, De Brecy, the influence I unrightly possess has never been and never shall be exercised but to do justice, to prompt aright, and to lead to honor. Now, let us go. Agnes, you must back with us to the court as the bride of him you love. Make no long preparation nor delay. You will find us waiting for you in the hall. Come, De Brecy, come. More lovers' words another time." When they reached the hall, Agnes advanced at once to the table, filled the cup, and drank. Then, turning gaily to Jacques Coeur, she said, "We have not been long, my friend. I went on purpose to cut caresses short. Our fair companion will be here anon. How brightly the stars are shining! Methinks it would be very pleasant if one could wing one's way there up aloft, and look into the brilliant eyes of heaven." A minute or two after, she turned somewhat pale, and seated herself in a large arm-chair which stood near. She said nothing, but an expression of pain passed across her countenance. Shortly after, De Brecy's Agnes entered, prepared to go, and Agnes Sorel rose, supporting herself by the arm of the chair, and saying, "Let us be quick. I feel far from well." She was soon placed in the litter, and they went on quickly toward Bourges. But once or twice during the short journey, Jacques Coeur put forth his head, urging the drivers of the litter to make more haste. When they entered the courtyard of his house, and the litter stopped before the great door, the good merchant sprang out at once, saying, "Help me to carry her in, Jean. She is very ill." They lifted her out in their arms, and bore her into the house, pale and writhing. Confusion and dismay spread through the court. Physicians were called, and gave some relief. She became somewhat better, well enough to travel to a distant castle. But ere 6 weeks were over, the kind, the beautiful, the frail, was in her grave, and none knew how she died. From that moment a fear of poison seized upon the mind of Charles VII., and affected the happiness of all his after days. The king did not keep his promise of being present at the marriage of De Brecy and Agnes de St. Florent, and their own joy was baptized in sorrow. End of chapter 53. End of Agnes Sorel by George Payne Rainsford James. Read by Lynne Thompson.